I never imagined my own blood would treat me like a disease, especially not on the most important day of his life. My son looked at me with pure disgust, his eyes scanning my uniform as if I had tracked mud into his perfect world. We were standing in the grand ballroom of the Buckhead Estate in Atlanta, surrounded by crystal chandeliers and walls draped in white silk. The room was filled with the elite of the city, wealthy investors, politicians, and socialites, all gathered to celebrate the wedding of my son. His name was Isaiah, a 34-year-old tech CEO who had just sold his first major software company. I was Marcus, his father, a 65-year-old retired Army veteran. I stood near the massive ice sculpture Maj, wearing my dress blues, the very same uniform I had worn with honor for decades. The deep blue fabric was perfectly pressed, and my medals rested heavily on my chest. I had spent an hour polishing the brass, making sure every detail was perfect, because I wanted to show my boy how proud I was. Instead of a smile, Isaiah marched toward me, his face tight with anger. His new wife, Brenda, walked a few steps behind him, her diamond necklace catching the light, her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. "What are you doing?" Isaiah hissed, stopping just inches from my face. I smiled, feeling a sudden knot in my stomach. "I'm attending your wedding, son," I replied softly, keeping my voice steady. Isaiah shook his head, his eyes darting around the room, making sure none of his wealthy friends were listening. "Not in that," he said, pointing a trembling finger at my chest. "Not wearing that ridiculous costume, Marcus. He did not even call me Dad." The word hit me like a physical blow, knocking the breath out of my lungs. "This is my dress uniform," I explained, touching the fabric near my collar. "I wore this to honor you, to show respect for this beautiful occasion." Isaiah let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "Honor me," he repeated, his voice dripping with venom. "You are embarrassing me, old man. Look around you. Look at these people. These are the most powerful figures in Atlanta. Billionaires, hedge fund managers, people who actually matter. They do not want to see some washed-up soldier playing dress-up at a high society event." The music from the string quartet seemed to fade away, replaced by the ringing in my ears. I looked at the bronze star pinned over my heart, remembering the terrible day in the desert when I earned it. I remembered the heat, the blood, and the young men I carried to the medical tent while mortar fire rained down around us. These medals were not a costume. They were the story of my life, a life spent sacrificing everything so Isaiah could sleep safely in his bed, so he could go to the best schools and build his little empire. Brenda stepped forward, placing a perfectly manicured hand on the arm of my son. "Isaiah," she whispered, "people are starting to stare. Just make him leave or make him change." I looked at the woman my son had chosen to marry, seeing the cold calculation in her eyes. "I am not leaving," I said, standing up straighter, forcing my shoulders back, "and I'm not taking off this uniform because I have earned the right to wear it." Isaiah stepped closer, closing the distance between us, his face turning a dark shade of red. "You earned nothing." He spat his breath, smelling of expensive champagne. "You spent your life following orders for pennies while I built a fortune from the ground up. I am a self-made man, Marcus, and you are just a painful reminder of the poverty I crawled out of." My heart shattered into a million sharp pieces, cutting into my chest with every beat. A self-made man, I thought to myself, remembering the double shifts I worked as a security guard after retiring from the military just to pay for his college tuition. I remembered the nights I skipped dinner so he could have new shoes for basketball, the weekends I spent fixing broken-down cars to afford his first laptop. I never told him about the struggle because a father is supposed to absorb the pain and project strength. I wanted him to fly without the weight of my burdens holding him down. But my silence had created a monster, an arrogant, entitled boy who believed he sprang into the world fully formed and entirely alone. "You will take off those stupid medals," Isaiah demanded, his voice rising, drawing the attention of the guests nearby. "You will go to the coat room, take off the jacket, and sit quietly in the back, or I swear to God I will have security drag you out into the street." The conversations around us stopped completely. Hundreds of eyes turned in our direction, watching the drama unfold like a twisted theatrical performance. I felt the heat of humiliation burning on my cheeks, but I refused to break his gaze. I survived 3 tours of duty. I survived ambushes, and I survived the loss of my brothers in arms. I would not be intimidated by a boy in a designer suit, even if that boy was my own flesh and blood. "No," I said calmly, letting the word ring out in the silent ballroom. "I will not hide, and I will not apologize for who I am." The air in the room grew thick, heavy with anticipation. Isaiah clenched his jaw, his hands curling into tight fists at his sides. "You stubborn, useless old fool," he snarled. "You always ruin everything you always have to make it about your pathetic glory days because you have absolutely nothing else." He raised his hand, and for a split second I thought he was going to adjust his tie. But the movement was too fast, too violent. He swung his arm out, and his fist connected hard against my cheekbone. The sound echoed through the massive hall, sharp and clear. I staggered backward, the force of the sudden blow snapping my head violently to the side. The taste of hot, sharp copper flooded my mouth instantly. A collective, horrified gasp ripped through the massive ballroom, followed by a terrifying dead silence. 300 of the most powerful people in Atlanta froze completely in place, their expensive champagne glasses hovering near their lips. I touched my cheek, feeling the warm, sticky blood pooling on my skin, and looked back at the man I had raised. Isaiah stood there, his chest heaving rapidly, his expensive suit jacket slightly wrinkled from the violent exertion. He did not look sorry, and he did not look ashamed. He looked exactly like a tyrant who had just successfully crushed a minor rebellion. "Security!" Isaiah bellowed, his voice cracking slightly with unhinged rage. "Get this old man out of my sight right now." 2 massive guards dressed in sharp black suits immediately started pushing aggressively through the crowded floor. Brenda hid her face behind her manicured hands, whispering furiously to her stunned bridesmaids. I braced my feet against the polished marble, preparing to be dragged out like a common criminal, but I refused to lower my head. I would walk out with the exact same dignity that I had walked in with. But before the heavy guards could take another single step, the dense crowd suddenly parted. A man stepped forward, moving with a silent, incredibly dangerous grace. He was tall, dressed in a flawless, custom-tailored charcoal suit that radiated quiet, terrifying wealth. His mere presence shifted the gravity of the entire room. This was Andre Sterling, a billionaire CEO, the absolute largest tech investor in the Southeast, and more importantly, a former United States Marine. Andre did not shout, and he did not rush. He walked directly up to Isaiah, his face carved from cold, unforgiving stone. Isaiah saw him approaching, and his arrogant, victorious sneer immediately faltered. "Mr. Sterling." Isaiah stammered frantically, attempting to smooth his ruined jacket. "I apologize for the ugly disturbance. My father was just leaving the premises." Andre did not say a single word. He reached out, his movements a sudden blur of calculated violence, and grabbed the right wrist of Isaiah. He twisted it sharply, forcing my proud son to his knees right in front of the entire elite ballroom. Isaiah let out a sharp, pathetic cry of pain, his face turning an unhealthy shade of pale. The advancing guards stopped dead in their tracks, completely terrified to intervene against a man of such immense, untouchable power. "You," Andre whispered, his voice slicing cleanly through the silent room like a freshly sharpened razor, "just made the absolute worst mistake of your miserable, pathetic little life." Isaiah groaned loudly, struggling hopelessly against the iron grip, but Andre simply applied more brutal pressure. "Do you know exactly who I am?" Andre asked, leaning in uncomfortably close to the face of my son. "Yes," Isaiah gasped, heavy sweat beading rapidly on his forehead. "You are Andre Sterling. You are the lead investor of my new tech firm." Andre smiled, but it was a terrifying smile, completely devoid of any human warmth. And do you know who this man is? Andre asked, gesturing respectfully toward me with his free hand. Isaiah squeezed his eyes shut tight, his voice trembling with a mixture of pain and deep confusion. He is just my father. He is just an old, washed-up soldier. He is Sergeant First Class Marcus Walsh. Andre corrected loudly, his powerful voice echoing off the high painted ceiling. And he is twice the man you will ever be in your entire miserable existence. Andre released the captured wrist with a hard, disdainful shove, leaving Isaiah sprawling clumsily on the hard floor, completely ruining his expensive designer trousers. Andre turned slowly to me, and the cold, terrifying fury in his eyes instantly vanished, replaced by a profound, unwavering respect. I saw the mutual recognition click perfectly into place. We had never formally met before tonight, but men who have walked through the deadly fires of war always recognize the silent ashes on each other. Sergeant Walsh, Andre said softly, bowing his head slightly in genuine reverence. It is a profound honor to finally stand in your presence. I looked deeply at Andre, fully understanding the silent, sacred bond of brotherhood, a bond that easily transcended any amount of corporate wealth and social status. Thank you, I replied smoothly, my voice remarkably steady, despite the fresh blood slowly dripping from my chin. But I truly believe I have overstayed my welcome in this place. I turned my attention back to Isaiah, who was slowly picking himself up from the floor, leaning heavily on a deeply embarrassed Brenda. I did not feel a burning rage, and I did not feel a sudden desire for petty revenge. I only felt a deep cold, an incredibly hollow sorrow. You have your shiny new world now, Isaiah, I said quietly, letting the words drift over the silent crowd. I truly hope it brings you the lasting peace that your heart is so desperately searching for. I did not wait for his inevitable angry response. I turned sharply on my heel, my polished black dress shoes clicking rhythmically against the marble floor, and began the long, quiet walk toward the main exit. The massive crowd parted eagerly for me, stepping back out of deep respect, or perhaps out of pure fear. I walked incredibly tall, keeping my broad shoulders perfectly square, the heavy bronze medals on my chest shining brilliantly under the crystal chandeliers. I left the extravagant ballroom, stepping out alone into the cool, refreshing, dark Atlanta night air. Back inside the tense ballroom, the heavy silence remained absolutely unbroken. Andre Sterling stood tall over Isaiah, looking down at him like a highly insignificant insect. Andre calmly reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket and pulled out a sleek, solid black phone. He dialed a secure number, holding the device tightly to his ear, his cold eyes firmly locked onto the terrified, confused face of my son. "Yes, it is, Sterling," Andre said clearly into the phone, his commanding voice echoing easily in the dead quiet of the giant room. "Execute Financial Protocol 0 on all of the Isaiah Walsh accounts. Yes, every single one of them. Burn it all down completely to the foundation and tightly lock the gates." Andre ended the brief call, smoothly slipping the expensive phone back into his dark pocket. He looked at Isaiah one final time, delivering a look of pure, unadulterated judgment. "Enjoy your expensive wedding cake, son," Andre said coldly, turning away. "Because when the sun comes up tomorrow, you will not be able to afford the crumbs." The morning sun pierced through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, waking Isaiah with a pounding headache. The threats of Andre Sterling from the night before felt like a distant, ridiculous dream. Isaiah was the king of the Atlanta tech scene, a self-made titan, and no single investor could erase him with a simple phone call. He dressed in a crisp linen suit, slipping his titanium black card into his pocket, eager to wash away the ugly memories of his father with a display of massive wealth. Brenda waited for him in the foyer, her eyes hidden behind oversized designer sunglasses, complaining endlessly about the terrible energy from the wedding reception. They drove their sleek silver sports car to the Piedmont Elite Club, an exclusive members-only restaurant, where the minimum annual fee was more than most people made in a decade. The post-wedding brunch was a tradition for the ultra-wealthy, a chance to sip imported mimosas and count the social victories of the weekend. Isaiah walked into the sunlit dining room projecting absolute confidence, nodding calmly to the various hedge fund managers and real estate moguls seated at the white linen tables. He guided Brenda to a prime corner booth surrounded by 6 of his most crucial board members and their perfectly styled wives. The brunch was a lavish, absurd display of excess. Isaiah ordered towers of fresh seafood, rare imported truffles, and 6 bottles of vintage champagne that cost $1,000 each. He laughed loudly, dominating the conversation, completely dismissing the embarrassing scene with his father as a minor, unfortunate family misunderstanding. He assured his board members that his tech empire was expanding rapidly, that new acquisitions were on the horizon, and that his personal wealth was absolutely untouchable. He needed to project supreme stability because in the ruthless world of high finance, any sign of weakness was an invitation for a swift execution. 2 hours later, the heavy porcelain plates were cleared, and the soft murmur of classical music filled the bright room. The head waiter, a tall man in a flawless white tuxedo, approached the table holding a thick leather folio. The total bill was staggering enough to buy a modest house in the suburbs, but Isaiah did not even glance at the printed numbers. He reached smoothly into his tailored jacket, pulled out his heavy titanium black card, and dropped it onto the silver tray with a loud, satisfying clack. The waiter bowed deeply and walked away toward the register. Isaiah leaned back into the plush leather booth, swirling the last drop of expensive champagne in his crystal glass, feeling completely invincible. But 10 long minutes passed, and the waiter did not return. Isaiah checked his gold watch, feeling a sudden tiny prick of annoyance. Then he noticed the head waiter standing near the heavy wooden doors of the kitchen, speaking frantically into a wall telephone, his face pale and shining with sweat. The waiter finally walked back to the table, moving incredibly slowly, his eyes locked firmly on the polished wood floor. He leaned down, placing the leather folio back on the table, keeping his voice painfully low. "I'm so terribly sorry, sir," the waiter whispered, "but this card has been declined." The conversation at the table instantly died. The powerful board members stopped smiling, their eyes darting rapidly to the black plastic card resting on the silver tray. Isaiah felt a sudden freezing cold spike of panic hit his chest, but he forced a loud, dismissive laugh. "That is completely ridiculous," he said smoothly, picking up the card. "There is no spending limit on this account. The bank must have flagged it for fraud after the massive wedding expenses last night." He reached into his pocket again, pulling out a heavy platinum corporate credit card and handed it directly to the waiter. "Just run this one," he ordered, his voice slightly tighter and louder than before. "Apologies for the annoying delay, gentlemen. Corporate banking security is always an absolute nightmare." The waiter took the platinum card and walked away quickly, but the atmosphere at the table had irrevocably shifted. The wives exchanged silent, highly knowing glances. 5 agonizing minutes later, the waiter returned, his hands visibly shaking against the silver tray. He placed the platinum card down right next to the black one. "Sir," the waiter stammered, looking absolutely terrified. "This card is also declining, and the machine is instructing me to physically confiscate the plastic." Isaiah felt the warm blood drain completely from his face. Brenda gasped softly, dropping her heavy silver fork loudly onto her empty plate. "What are you talking about?" Isaiah demanded, his voice rising in sudden, uncontrollable panic. "Run it again. Type the numbers in manually. You are clearly doing it wrong." "I have run it 4 times, sir," the waiter replied, stepping back slightly to avoid the anger. "I even called the exclusive merchant hotline, and they informed me that all accounts associated with your social security number have been frozen entirely and flagged for immediate liquidation." Isaiah stood up suddenly, knocking his heavy leather chair backward onto the thick carpet. It was a loud, ugly sound that drew the immediate attention of the entire dining room. The other wealthy patrons turned to look their quiet conversations, stopping completely. Isaiah looked desperately around the large room, and he saw the invisible weapons of social destruction being deployed. Men in tailored suits were looking down at their phones, reading sudden email alerts and whispering furiously behind their raised hands. The Atlanta corporate network was a tight, viciously connected circle, and news of a frozen empire moved faster than light. One of his most powerful board members, a ruthless venture capitalist named Harrison, slowly stood up from the booth. Harrison did not look angry. He simply looked at Isaiah like a dead man walking. "I think we will settle our own tabs today," Harrison said coldly, signaling swiftly to a different waiter. "We have some incredibly urgent matters to discuss at the office, Isaiah. Do not bother coming in today." The board members abandoned the table completely, leaving Isaiah and Brenda standing entirely alone in the center of the silent, staring dining room. The toxic whispers grew noticeably louder, washing over Isaiah like a freezing, suffocating wave. The impenetrable fortress of wealth he had spent a decade building was suddenly cracking wide open, and the cold, terrifying reality of absolute ruin was rushing in. The drive back from the exclusive restaurant was a suffocating, terrifying nightmare. Isaiah gripped the leather steering wheel of his sleek silver sports car, his knuckles turning completely white from the immense pressure. Brenda sat perfectly rigid in the passenger seat, staring blindly out the tinted window, her breath coming in short, rapid gasps. The silence inside the luxurious cabin was deafening, broken only by the low, powerful roar of the expensive engine. Isaiah desperately pushed the gas pedal toward the floor, needing the secure, familiar comfort of his massive mansion to anchor his spiraling reality. He turned the car sharply onto the private tree-lined road, leading directly to their sprawling Buckhead estate. The towering custom-iron gates were usually wide open, welcoming them smoothly into their $10 million sanctuary. But today the heavy black gates were pulled tightly shut. A large white commercial van was parked diagonally across the grand entrance, completely blocking the circular driveway. 4 burly men wearing dark, weatherproof jackets with the bold logo of a national bank printed on the back were actively drilling a heavy steel padlock into the intricate ironwork. Isaiah slammed violently on the ceramic brakes, the expensive tires screaming loudly against the smooth asphalt. He threw the heavy car door open, rushing frantically toward the locked gate. "What do you think you are doing?" Isaiah demanded, his voice shaking wildly with a mixture of rage and pure panic. "Open this gate immediately. You are trespassing on private property." A man in a cheap, poorly fitted gray suit stepped forward from the shadows of the large van. He was holding a remarkably thick stack of legal documents, neatly bound by heavy rubber bands. "You are Isaiah Walsh?" the man asked slowly, not bothering to offer a polite greeting or a professional handshake. "I am the owner of this estate," Isaiah shouted loudly, pointing an angry finger at the massive stone house sitting quietly in the distance. The man in the suit simply shook his head, looking down carefully at his printed paperwork. "Not anymore," he replied coldly, tapping the top page with a plastic pen. "This entire property, including the land and the primary structure, is officially owned by the Sterling Trust Holdings. We have received immediate irrevocable court orders to seize the asset entirely due to total, unrecoverable default on the underlying shadow loans." Before Isaiah could even process the terrifying, life-ruining words, a chaotic line of vehicles sped recklessly down the private road. 3 luxury sport utility vehicles slammed on their brakes, blocking the silver sports car entirely from behind. The car doors flew open simultaneously, and a highly agitated crowd of angry people spilled out aggressively onto the pristine driveway. It was the elite wedding planner, the master florist, and the head chef of the luxury catering company. The wedding planner, a woman usually known for her icy, unflappable composure, marched directly up to Brenda. "My final electronic invoice was just rejected by the banking system," the planner screamed, her face flushed red with absolute unrestrained fury. $500,000 for the silk draping the imported white orchids and the antique crystal rentals in the bank is telling me your corporate account does not even exist. The angry caterer stepped forward, next aggressively waving a crumpled piece of paper in the air. The wire transfer for the beluga caviar and the vintage champagne just bounced hard. He yelled loudly, moving uncomfortably close to Isaiah. I have a dedicated crew of 50 trained staff members waiting to be paid for working an 18-hour shift. And you handed me completely fake account numbers, you absolute fraud. Brenda stumbled backward, her sharp designer heels scraping awkwardly against the rough pavement. She looked wildly at the screaming hostile vendors, then at the heavily chained iron gates, and finally at her panicked, completely helpless husband. Isaiah. She gasped loudly, her voice trembling violently with rising hysteria. What is happening right now? Tell these people to stop screaming. Pay them their money right this second. I cannot do that, Isaiah whispered weakly, staring blankly at the massive, immovable steel padlock on his own front gate. The impenetrable fortress of wealth he had projected to the world was completely dissolving in front of his eyes. Everything is completely frozen. Brenda, I cannot access a single dime of my own money. Brenda felt the cold, terrifying reality crash down heavily on her perfect, carefully curated life. You told me you were a billionaire. She screamed at the top of her lungs, completely abandoning her rigid, high society poise. You told me we were untouchable royalty in this city, and now we are locked out of our own home like common criminals on our wedding weekend. She grabbed the lapels of his wrinkled linen suit, shaking him violently. Do something, she demanded, crying. The man from the bank stepped forward again, easily interrupting the chaotic public screaming match. Mr. Walsh, the bank representative, said loudly, making sure the angry vendors could hear every single word. I am legally required to formally inform you that your personal vehicles are also strictly registered to the Sterling Trust subsidiary. We currently have a commercial tow truck en route to physically secure that silver sports car, so I highly suggest you gather whatever personal items you have inside the cabin right now. Isaiah looked at the beautiful luxury car, the ultimate shiny symbol of his fake, entirely manufactured success. The angry vendors continued to shout relentlessly, pulling out their expensive smartphones to openly record his humiliating absolute downfall. The video would be everywhere in Atlanta within the hour. Brenda ripped the heavy diamond necklace from her throat, throwing it furiously at the chest of her ruined husband. You fix this disaster, she hissed viciously. Her face twisted with absolute disgust and pure hatred. You fix this immediately, or I swear to God I will file for a complete legal annulment by Monday morning. Isaiah stood frozen on the street, entirely surrounded by angry creditors locked out of his fake life, realizing the heavy dominoes were falling much faster than he could ever catch them. The cheap taxi smelled strongly of stale smoke and old air freshener. Isaiah sat perfectly rigid in the torn back seat, ignoring the heavy toxic silence radiating from his furious wife. They had managed to escape the chaotic screaming mob at the estate, leaving their luxurious silver sports car in the hands of the ruthless tow truck driver. Isaiah pulled out his smartphone, watching the bright screen flash violently with dozens of missed calls. Every single message was an urgent financial disaster, a desperate plea from an unpaid vendor, or a terrified text from an employee. Take us directly to the downtown financial district, Isaiah ordered the taxi driver, his voice tight with rising panic. Stop at the massive glass skyscraper on Peachtree Street. He needed to reach his corporate sanctuary. The tech firm was his absolute fortress, the undeniable proof of his brilliant mind. If he could just sit in his custom leather executive chair and log into his secure terminal, he could untangle this massive, terrifying financial knot. The yellow taxi screeched to a halt in front of the towering 80-story glass building. Isaiah threw a crumpled $100 bill at the tired driver, not waiting for the exact change, and practically sprinted toward the grand revolving doors. But before he could even reach the polished brass handles, a hand firmly grabbed his expensive shoulder. Isaiah turned wildly, ready to fight, but saw the pale, sweating face of his chief financial officer. David looked absolutely terrible. His expensive silk tie loosened his hair, completely disheveled, standing rigidly on the public sidewalk. He was holding a massive, heavy leather binder tightly against his chest, looking like a man who had just witnessed a horrific, fatal accident. David Isaiah gasped, grabbing the arm of the terrified executive. "Tell me you fixed the stupid banking glitch. Tell me the corporate accounts are fully functional." "There is no banking glitch," David whispered softly, looking around nervously at the busy, crowded street. "I cannot let you walk inside that pristine lobby, Isaiah. The building security team has completely deactivated our keycards, and federal marshals are currently seizing the physical computer servers on the 50th floor. That is completely illegal," Isaiah shouted loudly, ignoring the strange, judgmental looks from the passing pedestrians. "We are a highly profitable technology firm. We just posted record-breaking numbers last quarter." David shook his head slowly, pushing the thick, heavy leather binder directly into the chest of his ruined boss. "I printed the entire capitalization table." David explained, his voice shaking with absolute, undeniable despair. "I ran a deep forensic background search on every single dollar that ever entered our corporate accounts. Open the binder, Isaiah. Look at the actual names on the printed contracts." Isaiah ripped the heavy binder open, standing right there on the busy Atlanta sidewalk. He flipped frantically through the thick pages, his panicked eyes scanning the dense legal jargon and the complex financial charts. He saw the formal withdrawal notices from his three biggest, most crucial investors: Horizon Tech Ventures, Apex Capital, and the Vanguard Group had all pulled their massive funding simultaneously. "They are triggering the emergency morality clauses," David said quietly, his eyes fixed firmly on the gray pavement. "They claim your highly public, violent altercation at the wedding reception constituted a severe, unforgivable breach of executive conduct. They are legally demanding the immediate repayment of all outstanding bridge loans." Isaiah felt a freezing, terrifying drop in his stomach. "We do not have the liquid cash to cover those massive, multi-million-dollar loans," he whispered, his hands trembling violently against the thick, heavy paper. "It is much worse than that." David continued, pointing a shaking finger at a complex corporate flow chart inside the binder. "I traced the money, Isaiah. I followed every single shell corporation and every offshore holding company all the way back to the ultimate hidden source. Horizon, Apex, and Vanguard, they are not independent venture capital funds. Then what are they?" Isaiah demanded, the sheer panic rising hot and fast in his dry throat. "They are wholly owned subsidiaries of Sterling Industries," David revealed, stepping backward as if completely afraid of the violent reaction. The name hit Isaiah like a brutal physical blow to the chest. Andre Sterling, the terrifying, incredibly powerful billionaire from the wedding. The man who had grabbed his wrist, forced him humiliatingly to his knees, and spoken to his father with absolute, undeniable reverence. Isaiah stared blindly at the printed papers, his mind racing desperately to connect the impossible, horrifying dots. "Everything we built," David whispered, a single tear slipping down his pale cheek. "The initial seed money, the massive series funding, the favorable lease on the penthouse office space, it all came directly from Andre Sterling. He completely fabricated our success, Isaiah. He secretly placed his own loyal people on our board of directors. He approved the impossible credit lines, and now he has decided to burn the entire empire to the absolute ground." Isaiah could not breathe. The humid Atlanta air suddenly felt incredibly thin, completely devoid of oxygen. He remembered standing in the grand ballroom, his chest puffed out with total blind arrogance, telling his father that he was a self-made man. He remembered calling his father a pathetic, washed-up soldier, bragging loudly about the incredible fortune he had supposedly built from scratch. It was all a massive, humiliating lie. He was not a brilliant tech visionary, and he was not a ruthless corporate titan. He was a fragile, unknowing puppet, completely propped up by the invisible charitable strings of a billionaire. And the only possible reason a man like Andre Sterling would secretly fund his entire life was out of immense respect for the very father he had just violently humiliated. "Is there absolutely nothing left?" Isaiah gasped, his knees feeling incredibly weak, threatening to buckle entirely. "The company is entirely gone," David confirmed, flatly stepping further away from his former boss. "You are completely bankrupt, Isaiah, and you are facing tens of millions of dollars in immediate, inescapable personal liabilities. I strongly suggest you find a very cheap, very aggressive defense lawyer immediately." David turned and walked away, rapidly disappearing seamlessly into the dense crowd of busy, successful people. Isaiah stood entirely alone on the concrete sidewalk, holding the heavy leather binder that contained the total, undeniable destruction of his life. He looked up at the towering glass skyscraper, the beautiful monument to his massive ego, knowing he would never step foot inside it again. The absolute terrifying reality of his situation crushed down heavily upon him, leaving him with nowhere to run and absolutely nowhere to hide. High above the suffocating panic of the Atlanta streets, the air was perfectly still. The executive boardroom of Sterling Industries occupied the entire top floor of the tallest skyscraper in the city. The massive windows offered a commanding absolute view of the sprawling metropolis, reducing the towering buildings below to the size of mere toys. The long conference table was carved from a single flawless piece of dark mahogany. 12 senior executives sat rigidly in their plush leather chairs, their expensive tablets resting silently in front of them. The atmosphere in the room was incredibly tense, completely devoid of the usual corporate chatter. Andre Sterling stood perfectly straight at the head of the massive table. He had changed out of his formal suit from the wedding and now wore a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his forearms. He looked down at the sprawling city, his face reflecting completely off the heavy bulletproof glass. The room waited in absolute terrifying silence. No one dared to speak until the billionaire CEO gave them permission. Finally, a senior vice president named Thomas cleared his throat softly. "Mr. Sterling." Thomas began, his voice highly respectful but filled with deep confusion. "We have executed Financial Protocol 0 across the entire board exactly as you ordered last night. The tech firm of Isaiah Walsh is completely liquidated. The physical assets are fully seized, and the shadow loans are formally recalled." Andre did not turn around. He simply kept his cold eyes fixed firmly on the distant horizon. "Good," Andre replied, his deep voice carrying easily across the silent, expensive room. "Make sure every single offshore account is completely drained and strictly secure the personal real estate portfolio." Thomas shifted nervously in his heavy leather chair. "Sir, if you do not mind me asking, why did we do this?" Thomas asked carefully. The tech firm of Isaiah Walsh was projecting a 20% growth margin for the upcoming quarter. We just destroyed a highly profitable, incredibly valuable asset completely without warning. It is sending a massive shockwave through the Atlanta financial sector. Andre turned away from the massive window, his face carved from unyielding cold stone. He walked slowly back to the head of the heavy mahogany table, leaning his strong hands flat against the polished wood. "I did not build this incredible empire to merely chase profit margins," Andre said quietly, letting his powerful gaze sweep across the terrified faces of his executive board. "I built this massive wealth to wield absolute power and to enforce absolute loyalty." He reached to his side, picking up a heavy crystal decanter, and poured himself a small glass of dark-aged whiskey. "You all know the highly public story of my life," Andre continued, taking a slow, deliberate sip. "You know I inherited this massive company from my grandfather shortly after I was medically discharged from the Marine Corps. You know I spent 24 beautiful months serving in the blistering, deadly heat of Afghanistan." The executives nodded slowly, completely terrified to interrupt his slow, rhythmic speech. "What you do not know," Andre said, setting the crystal glass down with a sharp clack, "is exactly how I survived my final combat deployment in Kandahar." The massive boardroom was so quiet you could hear the faint hum of the expensive air conditioning system. We walked directly into a massive, highly coordinated ambush in a dry riverbed. Andre explained, his eyes staring blankly at the wall, seeing ghosts. It's from decades ago. 50 heavily armed enemy fighters rained absolute fire down upon our small patrol. My unit was completely pinned down, bleeding out in the dirt, waiting desperately for a painful death. I took heavy shrapnel in my left leg, completely shattering my femur. I was 19 years old, absolutely terrified and actively bleeding to death in the burning sand. Andre paused, letting the heavy, terrifying imagery settle over his wealthy, highly sheltered board members. I survived that horrific day solely because of one extraordinary man. Andre whispered, his voice thick with undeniable emotion. Sergeant First Class Marcus Walsh. He was a man of absolute unbreakable iron. He stood up directly in the lethal kill zone, ignoring the heavy bullets flying past his head. He threw my bleeding, broken body over his broad shoulders, and he ran 200 yards through a literal hellstorm of enemy fire to get me to the medical extraction point. Thomas swallowed hard, his eyes wide with profound shock. "The father of Isaiah Walsh?" Thomas asked softly. Andre nodded slowly, his jaw clenching with sudden, barely contained rage. "Yes, the father. When I returned home and inherited this massive fortune, I made a silent, sacred vow. I swore I would completely secure the legacy of the man who saved my life. I tracked down his only son, a struggling, arrogant college graduate named Isaiah. I secretly funded his entire pathetic life. I approved the initial seed money, I bought the strategic shell companies, and I forced the major banks to open unlimited, massive credit lines for him." Andre leaned forward across the heavy table, his eyes burning with a terrifying absolute fury. "I gave that boy a flawless golden empire completely disguised as his own hard work." Andre snarled loudly. "I let him believe he was a massive self-made genius, purely out of respect for the incredible blood his father spilled in the desert." The senior executives stared in stunned, breathless silence, finally understanding the massive, invisible charity project they had been managing for the past 10 years. But last night, Andre continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous, freezing whisper. "I watched that arrogant, spoiled boy publicly humiliate the greatest man I have ever known. I watched Isaiah punch his own father in the face, completely mocking the very uniform that guaranteed his wealthy, pathetic existence." Andre stood up perfectly straight, smoothing the front of his crisp white shirt. "The immense charity is permanently over," Andre declared firmly. "The massive debt to the son is entirely canceled, and the true loyalty remains solely with the father. I want Isaiah Walsh completely crushed, Thomas. I want him absolutely buried under a mountain of inescapable, terrifying debt. I want him stripped of every single dime, every luxury car, and every ounce of his fake manufactured dignity." Thomas nodded immediately, quickly tapping his electronic tablet to confirm the brutal, unforgiving orders. "It is already done," Sir Thomas replied swiftly. "He cannot even buy a cup of cheap coffee in this city right now." Andre turned his back to the long table, looking out the massive windows at the sprawling city once again. "Good," Andre whispered softly, entirely to himself. Let him finally learn the absolute, terrifying, true cost of his own unearned arrogance. Let him completely drown. The humid, oppressive Atlanta heat wrapped around Isaiah like a heavy, suffocating blanket. He stood entirely alone on the gray concrete sidewalk, staring blindly at the massive glass skyscraper he used to own. His crisp linen suit was completely soaked with nervous sweat, clinging uncomfortably to his shaking body. The terrifying revelation from his chief financial officer echoed loudly in his mind. Andre Sterling, the untouchable billionaire, had entirely fabricated his incredible success, all to repay a sacred life debt to his father. His entire life was a massive, humiliating illusion. But Isaiah did not feel a sudden, profound wave of remorse for how he had treated his father. His arrogant, narcissistic mind could only focus on pure, desperate survival. He could not lose his beautiful wife. He could not lose his sprawling estate. And he absolutely refused to become a poor, pathetic laughingstock in the elite corporate circles. He needed massive, immediate liquidity. He needed millions of dollars in untraceable cash just to pay off the furious wedding vendors and stop the federal marshals from digging any deeper. He knew regular, legitimate banks would not even look at him. His social security number was entirely blacklisted, flagged as a massive federal risk. He needed a shadow loan, a dangerous, highly illegal influx of dark money. Isaiah reached into his damp pocket, pulling out his expensive smartphone. He completely ignored the hundreds of angry, demanding text messages from his former employees. He scrolled desperately down to the very bottom of his contact list, looking for a specific dangerous name he had never intended to use. The name was Silas. Silas was a ruthless, terrifying underground financier who ran a massive, illegal gambling syndicate out of a dark, abandoned warehouse district in South Atlanta. Isaiah had met him once many years ago at a highly illegal, high-stakes poker game. Silas did not care about credit scores, corporate morality clauses, or frozen banking assets. Silas only cared about massive, exorbitant interest rates and absolute brutal leverage. Isaiah tapped the screen, holding the phone tightly to his sweating ear. The line rang 3 times before a heavy, rough voice answered. "Speak quickly." Silas commanded, his voice sounding like grinding gravel. "Silas it is." "Isaiah Walsh," Isaiah whispered, looking around nervously at the passing pedestrians. "I need an immediate massive bridge loan. I'm talking $10 million in completely untraceable liquidity by the end of the day." The line was completely silent for a long, terrifying moment. "You are front-page news today, little tech boy." Silas laughed coldly. "The streets are talking very loudly. They say your shiny corporate empire is completely burning to the ground and your expensive accounts are frozen entirely solid. It is just a temporary, highly annoying federal audit." Isaiah lied smoothly, forcing his voice to sound confident and aggressive. "My primary assets are perfectly secure, but I need immediate operational cash to handle a few panicked vendors. I will repay the $10 million plus a flat $2 million fee by next Friday." "I do not do business over the phone," Silas replied darkly. "Come to the Red Room Lounge on the south side right now. Come completely alone or do not bother coming at all." The line went entirely dead. Isaiah swallowed hard, his throat feeling like dry sandpaper. He had absolutely no cash for a taxi, and his digital wallet was completely suspended. He was forced to walk. He walked for 3 grueling, humiliating under the blazing, relentless southern sun. His expensive Italian leather shoes blistered his feet, and his perfect styled hair became a ruined, tangled mess. By the time he reached the rundown, graffiti-covered building on the dangerous south side, he looked like a desperate, broken beggar. 2 massive, heavily tattooed men guarded the rusty steel door of the lounge. They patted him down aggressively, their rough hands checking for hidden wires or weapons before shoving him roughly inside. The interior of the club was incredibly dark, smelling strongly of stale cigar smoke and cheap liquor. Silas sat alone in a circular, blood-red leather booth, surrounded by heavily armed men standing in the deep shadows. Silas was a massive, intimidating man wearing a dark silk shirt that stretched tightly over his heavy chest. He looked at the sweating, pathetic tech CEO with absolute, unrestrained disgust. "You look absolutely terrible, Walsh," Silas observed quietly, gesturing vaguely to the empty seat across from him. "Sit down and tell me exactly why I should hand $10 million to a completely ruined man." Isaiah slid into the red leather booth, his hands shaking violently on the sticky table. "My company is worth hundreds of millions of dollars," Isaiah pleaded, leaning forward desperately. "The federal freeze will be lifted by Wednesday. I just need to stop the bleeding right now. I will sign over the direct deed to my massive Buckhead estate as absolute collateral." Silas smiled, revealing a row of surprisingly perfect bright white teeth. "I know you do not own that estate anymore," Isaiah Silas whispered, leaning in incredibly close. "I know Sterling took it all back. Do not ever try to lie to me again, or my boys will cut your lying tongue right out of your mouth." Isaiah felt a cold, paralyzing fear grip his pounding heart. He was completely trapped. Then why did you let me come here? Isaiah gasped, his voice breaking entirely. Because desperate ruin men are incredibly profitable, Silas explained smoothly, sliding a thick, heavy legal document across the sticky table. I will wire the $10 million to an offshore shadow account in your name. You can use it to pay off your angry vendors and keep your beautiful, demanding wife happy for a few more days. But the interest rate is 10% compounded daily. That is completely insane, Isaiah choked out, staring at the terrifying document. I will never be able to outrun that kind of massive debt. That is entirely your problem, Silas said coldly, dropping a heavy silver pen on top of the paper. Sign the contract, take the dark money, and buy yourself a few more days of fake luxury. But fully understand this, Isaiah. If you miss the final payment next Friday, I will not send lawyers to seize your bank accounts. I will send my men to collect the debt directly from your physical body. Isaiah looked wildly at the heavy silver pen, feeling the invisible crushing noose tightening rapidly around his neck. He thought of Brenda screaming at him outside the locked iron gates. He thought of his massive, fragile ego, completely unable to accept public, undeniable defeat. He reached out with a trembling hand, picked up the silver pen, and signed his name at the bottom of the terrible document. Silas took the signed document, folding it neatly and slipping it into his dark silk pocket. The shadow funds will be available in exactly 10 minutes. Silas promised, his voice completely devoid of any human empathy. Enjoy your weekend, little tech boy. Because next Friday, the absolute devil will come to collect his due. Isaiah stood up on shaky legs, stumbling out of the dark, oppressive lounge and back into the blinding Atlanta heat. He had the massive amount of money he desperately needed, but as he walked blindly down the dangerous street, he knew he had just traded his entire soul for a few more days of an elaborate, pathetic lie. The flickering red neon sign from the cheap motel cast a sickening glow across the peeling wallpaper. 5 terrifying days had passed since the complete collapse of the tech empire. It was Thursday night, and the heavy Atlanta rain battered against the thin glass window of their dingy ground floor room. Isaiah sat on the edge of the stained mattress, his hands buried deep in his tangled hair. The $10 million in dark money from Silas was completely gone. It had vanished in less than 48 hours. Andre Sterling had tipped off the federal tax authorities, and the moment the offshore funds hit the local banking system, the government seized every single penny for unpaid corporate taxes. Isaiah had not paid a single vendor, and he had not secured his mansion. He had simply painted a massive, deadly target on his own back. Brenda stood near the rusted bathroom sink, violently throwing her expensive designer cosmetics into a leather travel bag. I cannot breathe in this disgusting place, Brenda screamed, her voice echoing harshly in the cramped room. There are cockroaches crawling on the damp carpet. Isaiah, I am a high society wife. I do not sleep in roadside motels. Isaiah looked up slowly, his eyes completely bloodshot and heavy with exhaustion. You are not a high society wife anymore, he replied bitterly, his voice completely hollow. You are the wife of a bankrupt, hunted man. The federal marshals took everything. Brenda, there is no secret account. There is no hidden trust fund. Brenda whipped around, her face twisted into a mask of pure, vicious hatred. You absolute pathetic fraud, she hissed, stepping closer to the terrible mattress. You swore you were untouchable. You swore we would rule this city, but you were nothing but a cheap charity case living off the pity of a billionaire. I gave up my prime years for you, and now I am hiding in a filthy room smelling like cheap bleach and despair. Before Isaiah could shout back, a massive, deafening crash shattered the argument. The flimsy wooden door of the motel room was violently kicked off its cheap metal hinges. It slammed down hard onto the dirty carpet, sending a cloud of gray dust into the humid air. 2 massive, heavily tattooed enforcers stepped over the broken wood rain, dripping heavily from their dark leather jackets. They were the terrifying men from the underground lounge. Isaiah froze completely, his heart slamming wildly against his ribs. Brenda let out a piercing, terrified scream, dropping her expensive leather bag onto the wet floor. Keep your mouth completely shut, the first enforcer ordered quietly, pointing a thick, scarred finger directly at Brenda. If you scream one more time, I will throw you through that glass window. Brenda clamped her shaking hands over her mouth, backing away slowly into the rusted bathroom, her eyes wide with absolute terror. The second enforcer walked purposefully toward the bed. He reached into his dark jacket and pulled out a heavy, solid steel wrench. He grabbed Isaiah by the throat, lifting him completely off the stained mattress, and slammed him violently against the cracked plaster wall. Isaiah gasped desperately for air, his feet dangling inches above the dirty carpet. Silas is incredibly disappointed in you, the enforcer whispered smoothly, pressing the cold, heavy steel wrench directly against the right kneecap of the ruined tech boss. We heard the federal government seized the $10 million. Silas does not care about your federal tax problems, little tech boy. Please, Isaiah choked out his face, turning an unhealthy shade of purple. I just need a few more days. I can liquidate my luxury watches. I can find a private buyer for the corporate patents. You have absolutely no patents. The enforcer laughed coldly, applying painful pressure with the heavy steel tool. Sterling owns all the intellectual property you own, absolutely nothing. Tomorrow is Friday, Isaiah. The final deadline. Silas wants $12 million in untraceable cash by sunset tomorrow. If you do not deliver the money, we are not going to kill you quickly. We are going to shatter both of your legs into tiny pieces, and then we are going to sell your internal organs to completely cover the outstanding interest. The massive enforcer dropped Isaiah roughly to the floor. Isaiah hit the ground hard, coughing violently, gasping for the humid, stale air. The two dangerous men stepped back over the broken wooden door, disappearing silently into the pouring rain, leaving the terrifying threat hanging heavy in the dark room. Isaiah stayed on the wet carpet, his body shaking with uncontrollable fear. He looked up, searching desperately for his wife. Brenda walked slowly out of the dark bathroom. She did not kneel down to help him, and she did not offer a single word of comfort. She simply reached down, picking up her heavy leather travel bag, and slung it smoothly over her shoulder. "What are you doing?" Isaiah asked, weakly holding his bruised throat. "I am leaving you," Brenda stated coldly, looking down at him with absolute unvarnished disgust. "You are a dead man walking, Isaiah, and I refuse to let the mob break my legs because you wanted to pretend to be a billionaire." "Brenda, please," Isaiah begged, reaching out a trembling hand toward her expensive shoes. "You are my wife. We have to stick together. We can figure out a brilliant plan." "There is no plan," Brenda replied sharply, kicking his weak hand away from her foot. "You insulted your father, you lost the company, and you borrowed money from the devil. You dug this massive grave entirely by yourself, and I am not climbing into it with you." She turned around, stepping carefully over the broken motel door, and walked out into the stormy Atlanta night. Isaiah listened to the sharp click of her expensive heels fading away on the wet concrete. He was entirely alone, sitting on the floor of a ruined motel with less than 24 hours to find $12 million or lose his life. The rain continued to pour relentlessly, beating heavily against the broken door frame of the cheap motel. Isaiah sat entirely alone on the dirty carpet, shivering uncontrollably in his damp clothes. $12 million. The impossible, terrifying number echoed loudly in his mind, hanging over his head like a brutal death sentence. Silas had given him exactly 24 hours before his violent enforcers would return, bringing their heavy steel tools to shatter his legs. Isaiah closed his eyes tightly, his mind frantically searching for a single viable escape route. He had absolutely no friends left in the elite corporate circles. He had no secret offshore accounts left to raid. His beautiful, ruthless wife had abandoned him entirely, leaving him to face the brutal mob completely alone. He thought deeply about Andre Sterling, the untouchable billionaire who had orchestrated this entire terrifying nightmare. Sterling had built the massive tech empire for him purely out of immense undying gratitude for a life debt owed to a retired soldier. A sudden twisted thought sparked brightly in the dark corners of the desperate mind of Isaiah. If Andre Sterling had secretly funneled hundreds of millions of dollars to the arrogant son of his savior, what kind of massive, completely hidden fortune had he given directly to the father? Isaiah remembered the tiny, incredibly modest apartment where his father lived. It was a complete, brilliant facade. It absolutely had to be a fake reality. Marcus Walsh was not just a poor retired veteran living quietly on a meager military pension. He was the single most important man in the life of a massive billionaire. Sterling must have set up secret untouchable trust funds, massive life insurance policies, and vast hidden real estate assets entirely in the name of Marcus. Isaiah felt a sudden frantic surge of dark, undeniable hope rising in his chest. His father was sitting silently on a massive mountain of invisible wealth, either completely unaware of its true corporate value, or simply hiding it entirely out of some misplaced, ridiculous sense of humble pride. But how could a ruined, highly disgraced son ever access those hidden funds? Marcus would never willingly hand over a single dime, especially not after the brutal, highly public assault at the lavish wedding reception. Isaiah stood up slowly from the wet-stained carpet, his legs still shaking violently from the terrifying mob visit. He paced back and forth rapidly across the small, dingy room, his mind working with cold, sociopathic precision. He could not simply ask for the massive fortune, and he certainly could not physically steal it from a highly trained, dangerous combat veteran. He needed complete, absolute, and undeniable legal control over the entire life of his father. Conservatorship. The heavy legal word flashed brilliantly in his desperate mind, offering a cruel, highly illegal path to immediate salvation. If Isaiah could legally declare his father entirely mentally incompetent, if he could convincingly prove to a busy judge that the old soldier was suffering from severe advanced dementia, he would be instantly granted total control over the entire estate. As the sole legal conservator, Isaiah would have immediate unrestricted access to every single bank account, every hidden trust fund, and every piece of financial leverage connected to Marcus Walsh. He could rapidly liquidate the secret assets, pay off the ruthless mob in full, and completely disappear from the city of Atlanta forever, starting a brand new life with whatever millions were left over. It was a highly vicious, utterly unforgivable plan. It required violently stripping his own flesh and blood of his basic human rights, his quiet dignity, and his hard-earned legal independence. But as Isaiah looked down at the broken motel door, remembering the cold, heavy steel wrench pressing painfully against his weak kneecap, he felt absolutely no moral hesitation. He was a cornered, highly desperate animal, entirely willing to devour his own father just to survive another day. He picked up his expensive, badly cracked smartphone from the floor. He knew he could not use a reputable, shiny corporate law firm for this incredibly dark task. His name was entirely blacklisted in the financial district, and absolutely no legitimate attorney would ever touch his ruined files. He needed a shadow lawyer, a desperate, morally bankrupt professional who operated exclusively in the murky, illegal, gray areas of the city. He needed someone who could quickly forge complex medical documents, bribe the necessary psychiatrists, and file an emergency expedited court order entirely without asking any inconvenient questions. Isaiah scrolled rapidly through the deep hidden archives of his email, desperately searching for a dangerous contact he had used many years ago to quietly settle an ugly corporate espionage dispute. The lawyer was a highly disgraced, entirely disbarred attorney named Victor, who now ran a highly illegal shadow legal clinic out of a dying strip mall in the suburbs. Victor specialized entirely in forged signatures, fake medical evaluations, and incredibly fast, incredibly dirty legal victories. The dark plan was incredibly risky and absolutely illegal, but it was the very last weapon he possessed. He would hire Victor immediately, paying him using the very last piece of expensive jewelry he had kept hidden deep in his pocket. They would draft an airtight, terrifyingly convincing emergency petition for total conservatorship. They would forcefully claim that Marcus Walsh was a severe, unpredictable danger to himself, suffering from aggressive, paranoid delusions directly stemming from his time in intense combat. Isaiah would play the tragic, deeply concerned son, forced to take heavy, heartbreaking legal action purely to protect his sick, rapidly declining father. Once the emergency legal order was signed by a corrupt or highly overworked judge, the banks would legally be forced to hand over the absolute keys to the entire hidden kingdom. Isaiah felt a cold, twisted smile form slowly on his bruised face. The cruel irony was almost beautiful to his sick, desperate mind. The very man who had unintentionally caused his massive public downfall would now become the exact instrument of his total salvation. He dialed the unlisted, untraceable number for Victor, listening closely to the hollow ringing, fully prepared to cross the final unforgivable line into total darkness. The heavy rain continued to batter the cheap motel, washing away the absolute last remaining shreds of his humanity, leaving only a cold, ruthless predator standing alone in the shadows. The heavy rain finally slowed to a cold, miserable drizzle as Isaiah approached the dying strip mall on the absolute edge of the city limits. The glowing neon sign above the shadow clinic flickered aggressively, buzzing with a loud electrical hum. Isaiah pushed open the heavy glass door, stepping into a cramped, highly depressing waiting room. The air smelled strongly of cheap coffee and stale cigarette smoke. A highly disbarred, completely disgraced lawyer named Victor sat behind a scratched wooden desk. Victor was a thin, nervous-looking man, wearing a cheap, poorly fitted gray suit. He looked up from a stack of highly disorganized legal files, his dark eyes scanning the ruined, desperate tech CEO. "You look like a man who is entirely out of options," Victor observed, quietly leaning back in his squeaky leather chair. "I need a completely airtight emergency legal miracle," Isaiah replied smoothly, walking directly up to the scratched desk. "And I need it filed before the courts open tomorrow morning." "Miracles are incredibly expensive," Victor stated coldly, tapping a yellow pencil against the dirty wood. "Especially for a man who is currently front-page news for losing a massive corporate empire overnight." Isaiah reached deep into the wet pocket of his ruined linen suit. He pulled out a heavy, solid platinum watch, his absolute last remaining piece of untraceable wealth. He dropped the expensive custom timepiece directly onto the scratched desk. The heavy metal hit the wood with a loud, incredibly satisfying clack. "That watch is worth easily $50,000, Isaiah explained, his voice tight with desperation and pure greed. "It is completely untraceable, bought entirely with clean cash 3 years ago. I want a total emergency conservatorship over my father, and I want it entirely finalized by tomorrow." Victor picked up the heavy platinum watch, examining the flawless, sparkling diamond face with a highly practiced, greedy eye. He smiled slowly, slipping the expensive timepiece directly into his deep suit pocket. "A conservatorship over a family member is highly complicated," Victor explained smoothly, pulling a blank legal pad toward him. "The courts generally require extensive medical evaluations, multiple psychological tests, and a very long, highly public legal hearing." "I do not have time for a long hearing," Isaiah snapped angrily, placing his trembling hands flat on the desk. "I owe $12 million to a highly dangerous underground syndicate by sunset tomorrow. If I do not get total legal control of the massive, hidden assets of my father, I am completely dead." Victor stopped smiling entirely, realizing the absolute terrifying stakes of the dark game. "Who exactly is your father?" Victor asked quietly, picking up his yellow pencil again. "His name is Marcus Walsh," Isaiah answered, his voice completely cold and entirely dead. "He is a retired Army veteran, 65 years old. He claims to live quietly on a highly restricted military pension, but I know for an absolute fact he is sitting on hundreds of millions of dollars in secret, completely hidden corporate funds." Victor typed the name rapidly into a highly encrypted shadow database on his cheap laptop. "A veteran makes this incredibly easy." Victor laughed softly, his fingers flying across the dirty plastic keyboard. Judges love to easily dismiss the sudden erratic behavior of old soldiers. We simply claim he is suffering from severe advanced combat-induced dementia. We state clearly to the judge that his mind is completely deteriorating, causing extreme violent paranoia. Isaiah nodded quickly, remembering the highly public, violent altercation at the lavish wedding. He hit me directly in the face in front of 300 elite guests. Isaiah lied smoothly, completely twisting the actual undeniable truth. He was highly confused, entirely delusional, claiming he was back in a dangerous war zone. "That is absolutely perfect," Victor smiled darkly, typing the entirely fabricated story directly into the official legal petition. "I have a highly corrupt, entirely unlicensed doctor on my immediate payroll. Dr. Evans will gladly sign a massive, terrifying medical affidavit formally diagnosing your father with a severe, irreversible psychological break. Evans will swear under oath that Marcus Walsh is an absolute immediate danger to his own physical safety and entirely incapable of managing his own financial affairs." "How fast can you legally file the fake documents?" Isaiah demanded, leaning closer to the glowing laptop screen. "I can electronically file the emergency petition at midnight tonight," Victor promised, printing a thick, heavy stack of highly illegal documents. The desperately overworked, entirely exhausted night court judge will review the fake medical files by morning. "But there is one massive, highly dangerous catch, Isaiah." "What is the catch?" Isaiah asked, his chest tightening with sudden cold panic. "Judges are entirely paranoid about massive conservatorship fraud," Victor explained carefully, sliding the thick stack of forged papers across the scratched desk. "They will absolutely demand some form of direct, undeniable proof that your father is entirely unaware of reality. I need you to go to his apartment immediately. I need you to trick him into signing a highly complex, completely confusing legal waiver. If you can produce a document featuring his genuine signature on a piece of paper he clearly did not understand, the tired judge will instantly grant the emergency control." Isaiah stared down at the heavy forged documents, feeling a sudden, completely twisted surge of dark adrenaline. He would have to face the man he had violently humiliated, look directly into his proud eyes, and entirely destroy his independent life. "Draft the confusing waiver," Isaiah ordered coldly, his voice completely devoid of any remaining human empathy. "I will go to his terrible, modest apartment right now. I will play the highly broken, deeply apologetic son. He is an old, trusting fool, Victor. He will absolutely sign whatever I put in front of his face if he thinks it will finally save his precious, pathetic child." Victor printed one final, highly deceptive document, attaching a bright yellow sticky note directly to the signature line. "Bring this specific page back to me by dawn," Victor commanded, handing the heavy legal folder to the ruined CEO. "And by noon tomorrow, you will be the absolute legal king of the entire Walsh estate." Isaiah took the heavy folder, clutching it tightly against his damp, ruined suit. He walked out of the depressing shadow clinic back into the freezing, relentless rain. He was a highly dangerous, completely desperate predator, now armed entirely with fake medical records and cruel, deceptive legal traps. He walked briskly down the dark street, heading directly toward the modest home of his father, ready to spring the ultimate unforgivable trap. The heavy rain finally slowed to a cold, miserable drizzle as Isaiah approached the dying strip mall on the absolute edge of the city limits. The glowing neon sign above the shadow clinic flickered aggressively, buzzing with a loud electrical hum. Isaiah pushed open the heavy glass door, stepping into a cramped, highly depressing waiting room. The air smelled strongly of cheap coffee and stale cigarette smoke. A highly disbarred, completely disgraced lawyer named Victor sat behind a scratched wooden desk. Victor was a thin, nervous-looking man, wearing a cheap, poorly fitted gray suit. He looked up from a stack of highly disorganized legal files, his dark eyes scanning the ruined, desperate tech CEO. "You look like a man who is entirely out of options," Victor observed quietly, leaning back in his squeaky leather chair. "I need a completely airtight emergency legal miracle," Isaiah replied smoothly, walking directly up to the scratched desk. "And I need it filed before the courts open tomorrow morning. Miracles are incredibly expensive." Victor stated coldly, tapping a yellow pencil against the dirty wood. Especially for a man who is currently front-page news for losing a massive corporate empire overnight. Isaiah reached deep into the wet pocket of his ruined linen suit. He pulled out a heavy, solid platinum watch, his absolute last remaining piece of untraceable wealth. He dropped the expensive custom timepiece directly onto the scratched desk. The heavy metal hit the wood with a loud, incredibly satisfying clack. That watch is worth easily $50,000, Isaiah explained, his voice tight with desperation and pure greed. It is completely untraceable, bought entirely with clean cash 3 years ago. I want a total emergency conservatorship over my father, and I want it entirely finalized by tomorrow. Victor picked up the heavy platinum watch, examining the flawless, sparkling diamond face with a highly practiced, greedy eye. He smiled slowly, slipping the expensive timepiece directly into his deep suit pocket. A conservatorship over a family member is highly complicated, Victor explained smoothly, pulling a blank legal pad toward him. The courts generally require extensive medical evaluations, multiple psychological tests, and a very long, highly public legal hearing. I do not have time for a long hearing, Isaiah snapped, angrily placing his trembling hands flat on the desk. I owe $12 million to a highly dangerous underground syndicate by sunset tomorrow. If I do not get total legal control of the massive, hidden assets of my father, I am completely dead. Victor stopped smiling entirely, realizing the absolute terrifying stakes of the dark game. Who exactly is your father? Victor asked quietly, picking up his yellow pencil again. His name is Marcus Walsh, Isaiah answered, his voice completely cold and entirely dead. He is a retired Army veteran, 65 years old. He claims to live quietly on a highly restricted military pension, but I know for an absolute fact he is sitting on hundreds of millions of dollars in secret, completely hidden corporate funds. Victor typed the name rapidly into a highly encrypted shadow database on his cheap laptop. A veteran makes this incredibly easy. Victor laughed softly, his fingers flying across the dirty plastic keyboard. Judges love to easily dismiss the sudden erratic behavior of old soldiers. We simply claim he is suffering from severe advanced combat-induced dementia. We state clearly to the judge that his mind is completely deteriorating, causing extreme violent paranoia. Isaiah nodded quickly, remembering the highly public violent altercation at the lavish wedding. He hit me directly in the face in front of 300 elite guests. Isaiah lied smoothly, completely twisting the actual undeniable truth. He was highly confused, entirely delusional, claiming he was back in a dangerous war zone. That is absolutely perfect, Victor smoothly, typing the entirely fabricated story directly into the official legal petition. I have a highly corrupt, entirely unlicensed doctor on my immediate payroll. Dr. Evans will gladly sign a massive, terrifying medical affidavit formally diagnosing your father with a severe, irreversible psychological break. Evans will swear under oath that Marcus Walsh is an absolute immediate danger to his own physical safety and entirely incapable of managing his own financial affairs. How fast can you legally file the fake documents? Isaiah demanded, leaning closer to the glowing laptop screen. I can electronically file the emergency petition at midnight tonight, Victor promised, printing a thick, heavy stack of highly illegal documents. The desperately overworked, entirely exhausted night court judge will review the fake medical files by morning, but there is one massive, highly dangerous catch, Isaiah. What is the catch? Isaiah asked, his chest tightening with sudden, cold panic. Judges are entirely paranoid about massive conservatorship fraud, Victor explained carefully, sliding the thick stack of forged papers across the scratched desk. They will absolutely demand some form of direct, undeniable proof that your father is entirely unaware of reality. I need you to go to his apartment immediately. I need you to trick him into signing a highly complex, completely confusing legal waiver. If you can produce a document featuring his genuine signature on a piece of paper he clearly did not understand, the tired judge will instantly grant the emergency control. Isaiah stared down at the heavy, forged documents, feeling a sudden, completely twisted surge of dark adrenaline. He would have to face the man he had violently humiliated, look directly into his proud eyes, and entirely destroy his independent life. Draft the confusing waiver, Isaiah ordered coldly, his voice completely devoid of any remaining human empathy. I will go to his terrible, modest apartment right now. I will play the highly broken, deeply apologetic son. He is an old, trusting fool, Victor. He will absolutely sign whatever I put in front of his face if he thinks it will finally save his precious, pathetic child. Victor printed one final, highly deceptive document attaching a bright yellow sticky note directly to the signature line. "Bring this specific page back to me by dawn," Victor commanded, handing the heavy legal folder to the ruined CEO. "And by noon tomorrow, you will be the absolute legal king of the entire Walsh estate." Isaiah took the heavy folder, clutching it tightly against his damp, ruined suit. He walked out of the depressing shadow clinic back into the freezing, relentless rain. He was a highly dangerous, completely desperate predator now armed entirely with fake medical records and cruel, deceptive legal traps. He walked briskly down the dark street, heading directly toward the modest home of his father, ready to spring the ultimate unforgivable trap. The rusted elevator groaned loudly, carrying Isaiah up to the 4th floor of the highly depressing brick apartment building. The narrow hallway smelled strongly of cheap cooking oil and old damp carpet. Isaiah stood nervously in front of the chipped wooden door, taking a deep, highly calculated breath. He needed to look completely broken, entirely pathetic, and deeply remorseful. He ran his shaking hands through his wet, tangled hair, intentionally making himself look like a man teetering dangerously on the absolute edge of total sanity. He raised his trembling right fist and knocked softly on the peeling wood. A full minute passed in heavy, terrifying silence. Isaiah knocked again, slightly harder this time, his heart pounding violently against his ribs. He heard the heavy metallic sliding of a solid steel deadbolt, and the cheap wooden door creaked open entirely. Marcus stood quietly in the narrow doorway, wearing a faded gray sweatshirt and dark, comfortable sweatpants. He looked entirely calm, absolutely grounded and completely untouched by the massive financial hurricane that was actively destroying the life of his son. "Dad," Isaiah whispered weakly, letting a fake, highly rehearsed sob catch loudly in his dry throat. "Please. I know I have absolutely no right to be here, but I have nowhere else to go in this entire city." Marcus looked down at the ruined, soaking wet linen suit and the terrified, severely bloodshot eyes of his son. He did not immediately step aside, and he did not offer a warm, forgiving, fatherly embrace. "What exactly do you want, Isaiah?" Marcus asked quietly, his voice carrying the heavy, unbreakable authority of a man who had survived a literal deadly war zone. "I lost absolutely everything," Isaiah cried loudly, dropping his face directly into his cold, shaking hands. "The massive tech company is entirely gone. The federal government seized all the corporate bank accounts, and Brenda left me completely alone in a filthy, dangerous motel room. I'm so incredibly sorry, Dad. I was a massive, arrogant, ungrateful fool, and I completely ruined my entire beautiful life." Marcus finally stepped back, slowly opening the wooden door much wider, allowing his ruined son to step inside the incredibly modest, spotlessly clean apartment. The small living room was furnished simply with old, highly functional furniture, completely devoid of any expensive, useless luxury. Isaiah walked heavily into the center of the tiny room, collapsing dramatically onto the faded fabric sofa, burying his face deeply in his damp, trembling hands. "I was incredibly angry at the entire world." Isaiah lied smoothly, forcing real, pathetic tears to stream rapidly down his bruised face. "I was completely consumed by my own massive, fragile ego, and I took it all out on you. You are a genuine, undeniable American hero, and I treated you like absolute garbage in front of everyone. I hate myself so much right now, I just want the horrific, crushing pain to stop." Marcus walked slowly into the small, bright kitchen, pouring a hot cup of strong black coffee, and brought it directly back to the small, scratched wooden coffee table. "Drink this slowly," Marcus said softly, his face completely unreadable, revealing absolutely no deep emotion or sudden pity. "You look like you have not slept a single hour in 5 entire days, Isaiah." Isaiah took the warm ceramic mug, his hands shaking violently on purpose, spilling a few dark hot drops onto the faded rug. "I owe $12 million to a highly dangerous underground criminal mob," Isaiah confessed loudly, mixing a tiny, necessary sliver of truth into his massive, terrifying web of lies. "They found me at the cheap motel tonight, Dad. 2 massive men pressed a heavy steel wrench directly against my kneecap, and they promised to shatter my bones into tiny pieces by tomorrow night if I do not pay them back in full." Marcus sat down heavily in his worn armchair, looking deeply into the terrified, desperate eyes of his son. "That is a massive, highly dangerous amount of illegal debt," Marcus noted calmly. "How exactly do you plan to handle a violent underground shadow syndicate, Isaiah?" "I have a brilliant, completely legal escape plan," Isaiah replied quickly, setting the warm coffee mug down heavily on the scratched table. "I found a highly secretive offshore private insurance policy that I bought completely in clean cash 3 years ago. It is worth exactly $15 million, and the federal marshals do not know it completely exists yet. I can legally cash it out tomorrow morning, pay off the ruthless mob entirely, and completely disappear from Atlanta forever." "Then what exactly do you need from me tonight?" Marcus asked quietly, leaning slightly forward in his old, comfortable chair. Isaiah reached carefully into his damp, ruined suit jacket, pulling out the highly deceptive, folded legal document he had received from the shadow lawyer. He placed the crisp, white paper gently onto the scratched coffee table, sliding it slowly, highly deliberately toward his father. "The offshore private insurance company is entirely terrified of massive federal fraud right now," Isaiah explained rapidly, his voice sounding incredibly desperate and highly vulnerable. "They placed a strict, unyielding security freeze on the massive account directly because of the massive public scandal at the wedding. They absolutely demand a secondary, completely independent family signature just to release the emergency offshore funds. It is just a highly standard, incredibly simple legal liability waiver completely confirming my physical identity and formally acknowledging my immediate, desperate financial distress." Marcus looked down carefully at the complex, highly dense legal document. The crisp paper was filled entirely with tiny, confusing legal jargon, completely masking the terrifying truth of the total, irreversible conservatorship petition. "If you sign this one single meaningless page," Isaiah begged, loudly, dropping forcefully onto his weak knees right on the faded rug in front of his father, "I can finally escape this terrifying, deadly nightmare. I can start completely over living a quiet life far away from this ruined city. Please, Dad. I know I do not deserve your incredible unearned mercy, but please save my pathetic life one final time. I swear to God I will never ever ask you for a single thing again." Isaiah looked up directly at his father, his eyes completely wide, pleading desperately for his total, fraudulent legal salvation. He held his breath entirely, knowing the massive hidden trap was completely set, waiting only for a single highly destructive stroke of a cheap ink pen. Marcus stared quietly down at the pathetic, kneeling figure of his son. The apartment was completely silent except for the heavy, rhythmic drumming of the rain against the small window. Isaiah kept his head bowed, his shoulders shaking with highly exaggerated fake oath, fully expecting the old, trusting soldier to simply surrender. But Marcus was not a naive, helpless victim, and he was certainly not blind to the dark, vicious trap snapping shut around him. Less than an hour ago, the secure, encrypted cell phone resting quietly in the pocket of Marcus had vibrated with an urgent, terrifying message. Andre Sterling possessed a massive, highly sophisticated corporate security team, and they monitored every single desperate move Isaiah made in the city. They had easily intercepted the shadow communications with the disbarred lawyer. They knew exactly what the fake, highly deceptive document truly was. It was not a simple, harmless insurance waiver. It was a complete, highly illegal petition for total conservatorship designed to legally erase the freedom of Marcus entirely. Marcus knew the hidden cameras were already rolling. The elite security team of Andre had quietly installed tiny, incredibly high-definition recording devices in the modest apartment, completely hidden inside the old smoke detectors, capturing every single word and every single deceptive movement. Marcus needed to give his vicious, greedy son exactly what he wanted to completely seal the final, inescapable legal doom of Isaiah. Marcus let out a long, highly convincing sigh, letting his broad shoulders slump heavily forward. He reached out with a trembling hand, intentionally mimicking the fragile, uncertain movements of a rapidly declining mind. He picked up the crisp white document from the scratched coffee table, holding it far away from his face, squinting his eyes in deep, fake confusion. "The words are incredibly small, Isaiah," Marcus mumbled quietly, letting his voice crack with sudden, uncharacteristic weakness. "My eyes are not working right today. Everything is highly blurry and my head feels incredibly cloudy." Isaiah looked up immediately, his bloodshot eyes widening with a sudden dark thrill of pure victory. He recognized the classic, highly documented symptoms of advanced cognitive decline, exactly the fake narrative he needed to legally sell to the judge. "It is just standard legal boilerplate," Dad Isaiah promised, quickly keeping his voice incredibly soft, highly soothing, like a predator calming a trapped bird. "You do not need to read the tiny print, just look right here at the bottom yellow line." Marcus rubbed his forehead vigorously, acting entirely overwhelmed, entirely lost in his own living room. "What day is it exactly?" Marcus asked, looking around the small space with wide, frightened eyes. "Did your mother call today?" "Isaiah, she usually calls me on Sundays to talk about the beautiful garden." The mother of Isaiah had passed away more than 10 years ago. Isaiah felt a massive cold rush of absolute triumph flood his desperate veins. His father was actually breaking down, completely losing his grip on reality, making the cruel, illegal conservatorship incredibly easy to legally justify in front of a tired judge. "It is Tuesday," Dad Isaiah lied smoothly, patting the trembling knee of his father with fake, disgusting affection. "Mom is totally fine. She's just incredibly busy right now. We really need to focus strictly on this important paper so I can finally go home and get some sleep." Marcus let his hands shake violently, dropping the heavy document back onto the scratched wood. "I do not understand any of this," Marcus whispered, acting completely terrified, highly vulnerable. "The loud noises outside, they sound exactly like the dangerous helicopters in the desert, Isaiah. I need to get my heavy rifle. The enemy is completely surrounding the perimeter." Isaiah grabbed a cheap plastic pen from the table, forcing it directly into the shaking right hand of his father. "There are no helicopters," Dad Isaiah insisted, pressing the tip of the black pen firmly against the bright yellow sticky note. "You are perfectly safe in Atlanta, but you absolutely have to sign this paper right now or the bad men will come through the front door and hurt us both." Marcus looked deeply at the pen, his heart completely breaking in absolute reality, fully realizing the terrifying depths of the depravity of his son. Isaiah was actively using the traumatic, horrific memories of war, intentionally triggering fake psychological trauma just to steal a hidden fortune. It was a vicious, unforgivable mental attack, and it cemented the final cold resolve in the chest of the old soldier. "I will sign it," Marcus whimpered softly, playing the pathetic, broken victim to absolute perfection. "Just please make the loud helicopters stop flying over the roof, Isaiah. My head hurts so incredibly much. I will make them stop," Isaiah promised eagerly, a cruel, highly victorious smile breaking across his bruised face. "Just write your full legal name right there on the bottom line, Dad, and the scary noises will go away completely." Marcus gripped the cheap plastic pen, letting his hand completely tremble highly, distorting his usually strong, perfect handwriting. He slowly, painfully scratched his signature across the bottom of the fake medical waiver, leaving a highly jagged, incredibly weak trail of black ink on the page. He intentionally misspelled his own middle name, adding another layer of brilliant, undeniable forensic evidence to the massive trap. He let the plastic pen drop heavily onto the floor, slumping back into the worn armchair, completely closing his eyes. "I'm incredibly tired now," Marcus whispered weakly, acting entirely drained of all physical life. "Please turn out the bright lights, Isaiah. I need to sleep for a very long time." Isaiah snatched the signed document from the table with terrifying lightning speed. He did not say a single word of thanks, and he did not offer to help his completely confused and highly vulnerable father to his bed. He carefully folded the crisp paper, sliding it quickly into the dry inner pocket of his ruined jacket. He stood up from the faded rug, completely abandoning the fake, pathetic remorse he had worn just moments before. "Rest well, old man," Isaiah said coldly, his voice returning entirely to its normal arrogant pitch. He turned around quickly, walking swiftly toward the wooden door, completely unaware of the tiny hidden camera tracking his highly deceptive exit, and entirely ignorant of the massive, inescapable legal destruction waiting for him in the morning. The heavy wooden door clicked shut, completely sealing the terrible betrayal inside the quiet apartment. Isaiah stood entirely alone in the dim hallway, listening to the rusted elevator hum in the distance. He reached slowly into his damp jacket, letting his shaking fingers brush against the crisp folded paper. A massive, incredibly twisted smile broke completely across his bruised face. He had actually done it. He had successfully destroyed the entire legal independence of his own father, and he felt absolutely no remorse in his dark, greedy heart. He walked briskly down the narrow corridor, ignoring the terrible smell of cheap cooking oil, feeling entirely like a massive, conquering king proudly returning from a bloody war. He pushed open the heavy front doors of the brick building, stepping back out into the cold, relentless Atlanta rain. The freezing water hit his ruined linen suit, but he did not shiver and he did not seek any warm shelter. The terrible storm suddenly felt incredibly refreshing, completely washing away the pathetic, desperate fear that had choked his throat for 5 long days. He was not a ruined tech executive anymore, and he was absolutely not a helpless victim of a billionaire. He was a ruthless, highly calculating survivor, securely holding the ultimate golden key to a completely hidden financial empire. Isaiah walked aggressively down the wet concrete sidewalk, his expensive Italian shoes splashing loudly in the deep puddles. He pulled his badly cracked smartphone from his wet pocket, entirely ignoring the hundreds of angry notifications from unpaid vendors. He dialed the shadow number for Victor, holding the cold plastic tightly against his ear. "I have the authentic signature," Isaiah announced, proudly, speaking very loudly over the heavy sound of the falling rain. "The old fool signed exactly where you told him to sign, and he did not ask a single rational question." He was entirely terrified, rambling wildly about scary helicopters and dangerous war zones. The disbarred lawyer laughed softly on the other end of the line, a highly corrupt, deeply greedy sound. "That is absolutely brilliant work," Victor replied smoothly. "Bring the physical paper directly to my shadow clinic right now, Isaiah. I have the highly illegal medical evaluations completely finished, and my corrupt doctor signed every single fake psychological affidavit. We will electronically file the massive emergency petition before the sun even comes up, and the tired night judge will stamp it entirely approved by breakfast. I'm walking there right now," Isaiah declared confidently, his chest completely puffing out with massive unearned arrogance. "Make absolutely sure the temporary legal control grants me immediate, highly unrestricted access to all federal and private banking institutions. I need to wire $12 million to a shadow syndicate by tomorrow afternoon, or the mob will break my legs entirely. You will have absolute, terrifying legal power over every single dime he possesses," Victor promised darkly. "The emergency court order will legally classify your father as entirely incompetent, completely stripping him of all financial rights, all medical autonomy, and all basic legal standing. You can freely liquidate his secret accounts, sell his hidden properties, and even forcefully commit him to a highly restricted locked psychiatric ward if he ever tries to fight back. Isaiah ended the phone call, sliding the cracked device back into his wet pocket. The dark, vicious idea of committing his father to a locked, terrible mental ward brought a sudden, incredibly cruel joy to his greedy heart. It was the absolute perfect revenge for the massive humiliation at the lavish wedding reception. He would completely drain the hidden millions provided by Andre Sterling, pay off the ruthless mob entirely, and then completely dispose of his broken father, leaving him rotting in a cheap, highly depressing state facility. He walked for 2 solid hours through the dark, stormy city, his mind racing wildly with massive, completely arrogant plans for his sudden stolen wealth. He would buy a brand new, highly secretive offshore estate completely far away from the judgmental elite circles of Atlanta. He would buy an entirely new fleet of luxury sports cars, paying strictly in absolute untraceable cash. He even thought deeply about calling his incredibly selfish wife, Brenda, fully intending to cruelly flash his massive new bank accounts directly in her face before formally filing for a highly aggressive, deeply punishing divorce. The dying neon sign of the shadow clinic finally appeared brightly through the heavy rain. Isaiah practically ran toward the dirty glass doors, clutching his damp jacket tightly, violently protecting the terrible forged document. He pushed his way inside the cramped, depressing waiting room, completely ignoring the stale smell of cheap smoke. Victor was standing directly behind the scratched wooden desk, holding a thick, incredibly heavy stack of official court filings, completely ready to execute the massive, unforgivable crime. Isaiah reached into his pocket, pulling out the crisp white paper featuring the weak, highly distorted signature of his father. He slammed it down hard onto the scratched desk, his bruised face twisting into a mask of pure, absolute greed. Victor picked up the paper, examining the jagged ink, closely smiling with absolute corrupt satisfaction. "File the massive petition right now." Isaiah ordered coldly, completely crossing the final absolute point of no return. "Take his entire life away from him, Victor, and give me the heavy crown I truly deserve." The rusted elevator hummed loudly in the distance, carrying the treacherous sun down to the cold street. Inside the quiet apartment, the heavy, pathetic atmosphere instantly vanished. Marcus stood up straight from the worn armchair, his broad shoulders squaring completely. The weak, confused tremor in his hands disappeared entirely, replaced by the steady, unyielding calm of a highly decorated combat veteran. He walked slowly toward the small kitchen, pouring the cold coffee down the stainless steel sink, entirely done with the exhausting, disgusting performance. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the highly encrypted black smartphone provided by Sterling Industries. He pressed a single button and the screen glowed brightly. The connection opened immediately. "The bait is completely taken," Marcus said clearly into the dark phone, his voice sharp and commanding. "He has the signed paper and he is marching directly to his shadow lawyer right now. We have his physical location completely tracked." Andre Sterling replied smoothly through the tiny speaker. Within 20 minutes, the heavy glass doors of the apartment building swung open and 3 men walked briskly down the narrow hallway. Marcus unlocked the deadbolt, letting the powerful billionaire step inside the modest living room. Andre was flanked by 2 incredibly sharp men in flawless custom Navy suits. These were not heavy muscle enforcers, but something far more dangerous in the corporate world. They were elite aggressive trial lawyers, heavily armed with massive leather briefcases and an absolute arsenal of destructive legal precedents. "It is an absolute honor to see you again," Sergeant Andre said respectfully, bowing his head slightly. "Let me introduce Jonathan Hayes, the absolute best, most ruthless litigator in the entire state of Georgia." Hayes stepped forward confidently, placing a sleek silver laptop directly onto the scratched coffee table. He did not offer a soft, comforting smile, but a cold, highly calculated nod. "We tapped directly into the hidden camera feeds 10 minutes ago." Hayes explained quickly, his fingers flying rapidly across the sleek keyboard. The high-definition footage is completely processed, fully time-stamped, and legally verified by our independent forensic experts. Hayes turned the bright screen toward Marcus and Andre. The incredibly clear, flawless video played in the quiet room, showing the exact highly deceptive encounter that had just occurred. They watched the ruined tech CEO burst into the room, dropping heavily to his weak knees, violently crying his fake, pathetic tears. They heard Isaiah aggressively lying about the offshore insurance policy, viciously using the massive mob debt to force immense, unearned sympathy from his own father. But the most damning, utterly horrific moment was the cruel psychological manipulation. The high-definition audio caught every single vicious word perfectly. They heard Isaiah actively encouraging the fake, terrifying combat delusions, completely dismissing the imaginary helicopters and aggressively forcing the cheap plastic pen into the trembling hand of a supposedly broken man. "Watching it back makes my absolute blood boil," Andre whispered dangerously, his massive hands clenching into tight, violent fists at his sides. "He actively used your incredibly traumatic combat service as a cheap, dirty weapon to steal a fake fortune. It is an entirely unforgivable, massive betrayal of everything sacred." Marcus watched the glowing screen, his face completely carved from solid stone, showing absolutely no fear. "He is entirely blind to reality," Marcus noted, calmly looking at the frozen face of his greedy son. "He believes he is incredibly brilliant, entirely outsmarting a broken, senile old man." Hayes paused, the crystal-clear video freezing the frame exactly on the jagged, intentionally misspelled signature. "It is an absolutely flawless, completely airtight federal trap," Hayes declared confidently, tapping the silver screen with his expensive metal pen. "We legally own his entire shadow lawyer right now. Our private investigators hacked the highly unsecure servers of the Shadow Clinic an hour ago. We possess every single forged medical document, every fake psychological affidavit, and the completely drafted emergency conservatorship petition." "Should we intercept the massive filing tonight?" Andre asked quickly, looking directly at the sharp-blade lawyer. "We can easily destroy the disbarred attorney before he even reaches the courthouse." "Absolutely not," Hayes replied sharply, his eyes gleaming with absolute predatory excitement. "If we stop the filing tonight, Isaiah simply gets a minor, highly inconvenient slap on the wrist for attempted fraud. We need him to legally walk into a massive, highly public courtroom. We need him to stand directly in front of a sworn federal judge and aggressively present these forged documents as absolute, undeniable truth. The moment he officially submits the fake paperwork to the judge," Hayes continued, his voice dropping to a cold, terrifying whisper, "the simple, quiet civil matter instantly transforms into a massive, highly dangerous criminal conspiracy. He is actively committing aggressive elder abuse, massive perjury, and severe multi-million-dollar wire fraud. The federal sentencing guidelines for this specific combination of highly illegal actions carry a mandatory, completely inescapable minimum of 20 years in a maximum security federal prison." Marcus looked down at the scratched coffee table, feeling a heavy, dark sorrow mixed directly with absolute necessary justice. His son had violently chosen this terrible path, completely blinded by massive ego and pure toxic greed. "Let him completely dig the massive grave," Marcus ordered, quietly giving the final absolute command to the legal team. "Let him walk proudly into the courtroom tomorrow, fully believing he is the absolute king of the world and holding the keys to the entire empire." Andre nodded slowly, entirely agreeing with the heavy, destructive strategy. "We will assemble the entire massive legal team at the Fulton County Courthouse by dawn," Andre promised softly. "We will let the arrogant boy confidently spin his massive web of lies to the exhausted judge, and then we will drop the absolute heavy hammer of justice directly on his arrogant head." Hayes closed the sleek silver laptop with a loud, incredibly satisfying snap. "Get some real rest tonight," Sergeant Walsh, Hayes advised respectfully, packing his expensive electronic gear back into his heavy leather briefcase. "Because tomorrow morning we are going to legally execute your son entirely in broad daylight." The elite team filed quietly out of the modest apartment, leaving Marcus entirely alone in the quiet, dim living room. He walked slowly over to the small window, looking out at the heavy, freezing Atlanta rain. The massive trap was perfectly set. The hidden cameras had captured the absolute truth, and the incredible heavy dominoes were entirely stacked, waiting only for Isaiah to confidently push the very first piece. The heavy oak doors of the Fulton County courtroom swung open slowly, revealing the cold, highly sterile environment of emergency legal proceedings. It was 8 o'clock in the morning, and the massive, windowless room smelled entirely of stale coffee and old floor wax. The exhausted night court judge, a stern woman named Miller, sat heavily behind the elevated wooden bench, rubbing her tired eyes. She had been reviewing complex, highly confusing emergency petitions all night, and her patience was completely wearing thin. Isaiah sat confidently at the wooden petitioner table wearing a brand new, sharply tailored dark suit, bought entirely with a tiny fraction of the remaining mob money. He looked completely refreshed, highly groomed, and entirely ready to claim his massive stolen crown. Victor, the completely disbarred shadow lawyer, sat closely beside him, arranging the thick, highly forged medical files into neat, highly deceptive piles. At the defense table, Marcus sat entirely alone. He wore his faded gray sweatshirt, deliberately slouching his broad shoulders forward, staring blankly at the polished wood. He played the part of the severely broken, completely confused victim to absolute perfection. He did not look angry, and he did not look like a highly decorated combat veteran. He just looked like a sad, entirely lost old man, completely overwhelmed by the massive, terrifying legal system. Judge Miller banged her heavy wooden gavel loudly, demanding immediate absolute silence in the quiet courtroom. "We are here to review the emergency, highly expedited petition for total conservatorship," Judge Miller announced loudly, staring down at the thick stack of forged papers. "The petitioner is Isaiah Walsh, seeking absolute immediate legal and financial control over the primary respondent, Marcus Walsh." Victor stood up smoothly, buttoning his cheap gray suit jacket, projecting a highly fake air of profound professional sorrow. "Thank you, Your Honor," Victor began smoothly, his voice dripping with highly rehearsed, disgusting sympathy. "This is an incredibly tragic, deeply heartbreaking family situation. My client is entirely devastated, completely forced to take this drastic, incredibly heavy legal action purely to protect the physical safety of his beloved father." Judge Miller flipped slowly through the forged medical documents. "I'm reading a highly disturbing, completely terrifying psychiatric affidavit here," the judge noted carefully. "Dr. Evans states clearly that the respondent is suffering from severe, highly advanced combat-induced dementia. He claims the respondent is experiencing highly aggressive, incredibly violent paranoid delusions." "That is entirely correct, Your Honor." Victor lied flawlessly, stepping out from behind the wooden table. "The tragic reality is that Marcus Walsh is entirely trapped in a horrific, incredibly dangerous mental war zone. Just 3 days ago, at a highly public, massive social event, the respondent suffered a severe, completely unprovoked psychotic break. He became incredibly violent, physically assaulting my client entirely without warning in front of hundreds of highly terrified witnesses." Isaiah buried his face directly into his perfectly manicured hands, letting his shoulders shake violently, projecting a highly convincing, utterly fake sob. "I just want my father back," Isaiah cried loudly, forcing the fake, pathetic tears to stream completely down his face. "I want to get him the incredibly expensive, highly specialized medical care he desperately needs, Your Honor. I cannot sit back and watch his brilliant mind completely disintegrate into terrifying, violent madness." Marcus remained entirely silent, keeping his head bowed low, listening carefully to the massive, highly coordinated web of absolute lies. He was waiting patiently for the exact perfect moment, letting the arrogant boy completely dig the massive federal grave. "The medical claims are incredibly severe," Judge Miller stated firmly, leaning forward over the high wooden bench. "But taking away the absolute legal independence of a grown man is the most serious, incredibly heavy action this court can possibly take. I need absolute, undeniable physical proof that the respondent is entirely unaware of his own legal reality. I need direct evidence of severe advanced cognitive failure. Victor smiled darkly, reaching smoothly into his heavy leather briefcase. He pulled out the crisp white document featuring the jagged, intentionally misspelled signature of Marcus. "We anticipated the heavy burden of proof, Your Honor," Victor explained proudly, walking directly up to the elevated bench, handing the highly deceptive paper to the tired judge. "Last night, my client visited the highly modest, severely depressing apartment of his father. He presented him with a massive, incredibly complex legal document formally signing away his entire estate." Victor paused perfectly, letting the heavy, terrifying legal implication completely settle in the quiet room. A rational, entirely sane man would absolutely never sign away his entire life without demanding a massive legal review, Victor argued loudly. But the respondent was completely terrified, highly confused, babbling wildly about imaginary helicopters and dangerous enemy forces. He signed the incredibly damaging document instantly, entirely, to make the scary noises go away. Judge Miller looked closely at the highly distorted, jagged black ink on the page. "The signature is incredibly weak," she noted quietly, "and the middle name is completely misspelled." "Exactly, Your Honor." Victor agreed quickly, completely seizing the massive forged victory. "He does not even remember how to spell his own name. He is completely lost in the dark. We humbly request the immediate total transfer of all financial assets and absolute highly restricted medical power of attorney be granted directly to the son today." Isaiah peeked out from behind his shaking hands, a massive, incredibly arrogant smile forming completely on his hidden face. The trap was entirely flawless, the exhausted judge was completely convinced, and the hidden massive millions were finally absolutely his. Judge Miller sighed heavily, reaching for her official heavy black ink pen. "I have carefully reviewed the medical evidence," the judge announced loudly, entirely ready to completely destroy the life of the old soldier. "Based on the highly disturbing psychiatric affidavits and the clear, undeniable proof of severe cognitive decline, I am prepared to fully grant the total emergency conservatorship petition." Isaiah let out a massive, highly relieved breath, his heart soaring completely into the bright sky. He had actually won the massive, incredibly dangerous game. But before the heavy black pen could even touch the official binding legal order, the massive, heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom burst violently open. "Stop the proceedings immediately," a massive, incredibly powerful voice boomed, loudly echoing violently against the cold, bare walls. Every single head in the sterile courtroom snapped violently backward, completely shocked by the aggressive sudden interruption. Andre Sterling strode confidently down the center aisle, moving with the terrifying absolute grace of a highly trained predator. He was wearing a flawless, custom-tailored charcoal suit, his broad shoulders easily dominating the cramped space. He was not walking entirely alone. Behind him marched a highly intimidating, absolute phalanx of elite corporate attorneys led directly by the ruthless, incredibly sharp lead counsel, Jonathan Hayes. The entire dynamic of the room shifted instantly, the temperature dropping completely to absolute freezing. The exhausted night judge, Judge Miller, dropped her heavy black pen immediately, her tired eyes widening with sudden, profound shock. She instantly recognized the towering, untouchable billionaire, a man whose massive corporate empire practically funded half the charities and massive infrastructure projects in the entire state. "What is the absolute meaning of this massive disruption?" Judge Miller demanded loudly, her voice completely losing its tired edge, replaced entirely by highly alert defensive authority. Isaiah froze completely in his polished wooden chair. The massive, arrogant smile vanished instantly from his bruised face, replaced by a cold, absolutely suffocating mask of pure, undeniable terror. He looked wildly at the completely disbarred shadow lawyer sitting nervously beside him. Victor had turned a sickening ashen shade of gray, his hands shaking violently as he stared directly at the approaching legal team. Victor knew exactly who the elite litigator was, recognizing Jonathan Hayes instantly as the absolute undisputed apex predator of the entire Georgia legal system. "My name is Andre Sterling, the billionaire." announced smoothly, his deep, commanding voice filling every single corner of the quiet courtroom. And the man sitting immorally alone at the defense table, the man your court is currently preparing to legally destroy, is my personal hero and my absolute undeniable brother-in-arms. Jonathan Hayes stepped smoothly past the massive billionaire, carrying a massive, incredibly heavy black leather briefcase. He walked directly up to the elevated wooden bench, completely ignoring the panicked, sweating tech CEO. "Good morning, Your Honor," Hayes said sharply, his voice completely devoid of any warm, polite, legal pleasantries. "I am Jonathan Hayes, Senior Managing Partner at Sterling Legal Holdings. I'm formally entering my absolute immediate appearance as the primary sworn legal counsel for the respondent, Sergeant First Class Marcus Walsh." Judge Miller looked deeply confused, glancing rapidly back and forth between the elite legal team and the supposedly broken, severely senile old man sitting quietly at the table. "Mr. Hayes," the judge stated carefully, shifting her heavy robes. "This is a highly sensitive, closed emergency conservatorship hearing. The petitioner has clearly presented overwhelming, legally binding medical evidence, completely proving your client is entirely incompetent." Isaiah jumped up frantically from his wooden chair, his brand new, expensive suit completely soaked in sudden cold sweat. "This is completely outrageous," Isaiah shouted loudly, his voice cracking violently with absolute unhinged panic. "He has absolutely no legal standing here. Your Honor, this billionaire simply has a massive, completely weird obsession with my sick father. Please, you must sign the legal order right now. The medical documents are entirely verified. Sit down completely and keep your mouth entirely shut." Hayes snapped viciously, turning his cold, predatory eyes directly onto the ruined son. "You are standing on the absolute, highly dangerous edge of a massive federal prison sentence, boy. I highly suggest you stop digging this horrific, inescapable grave." Victor tugged desperately on the sleeve of his ruined client, forcefully pulling Isaiah back down into the hard, wooden chair. "Do not say another single word," Victor whispered frantically, his voice trembling with pure, unadulterated fear. "That is Jonathan Hayes, Isaiah. He will completely destroy our entire lives before lunchtime even arrives." Hayes turned his sharp attention back to the highly confused judge, placing the massive, heavy leather briefcase directly onto the polished wooden table. He popped the shiny gold latches, the sharp, metallic clicks echoing loudly in the completely silent room. "Your Honor," Hayes began smoothly, his voice projecting absolute, undeniable authority. "The petitioner has completely lied to this court. He has actively presented entirely forged, highly illegal documents. Every single medical affidavit you just read is completely fake, signed by a thoroughly corrupt, entirely unlicensed shadow doctor. That is a massive, incredibly serious legal accusation, Mr. Hayes." Judge Miller warned quietly, completely leaning forward over the high bench, her eyes narrowing sharply. "You are actively accusing this young man and his supposed legal counsel of severe, highly aggressive federal perjury." "I'm accusing them of much worse than simple perjury, Your Honor," Hayes corrected coldly, reaching deep into the heavy briefcase. "I am officially accusing Isaiah Walsh of highly coordinated multi-million-dollar wire fraud, aggressive, vicious elder abuse, and severe criminal extortion. And I brought absolute, undeniable physical proof to completely destroy this fake, highly pathetic legal circus." The thin, stale air in the courtroom completely vanished. Isaiah felt his entire arrogant world violently collapsing, entirely crushing his weak lungs. He looked desperately over at his father, fully expecting to see the broken, confused old maid he had viciously tricked last night. But Marcus was no longer slouching in his chair. The old soldier sat perfectly straight, his broad chest puffed out proudly, his sharp, highly intelligent eyes locked directly onto his terrified son. Marcus did not look confused, and he absolutely did not look afraid. He looked exactly like a highly decorated, incredibly dangerous combat veteran who had successfully lured the blind enemy directly into the absolute perfect kill zone. The heavy, terrifying realization hit Isaiah like a massive, speeding freight train, completely shattering his arrogant mind. The highly pathetic performance at the apartment, the weak, trembling hands, the wild, crazy talk about imaginary helicopters, it was all a massive, entirely deliberate trap. His father had known absolutely everything from the very beginning. Hayes pulled a thick, heavy blue folder from his massive briefcase, slapping it down loudly onto the polished wooden table. Let us begin with the absolute highly hilarious futility of this entire massive criminal enterprise, Hayes announced smoothly, his voice cutting through the silent room like a freshly sharpened blade. Even if this honorable court completely granted the massive conservatorship, the highly greedy petitioner would not receive a single pathetic dime. Judge Miller looked down at the heavy blue folder, her tired eyes scanning the complex, highly official legal seals. "What exactly is this document, Mr. Hayes?" the judge asked, quietly, completely fascinated by the massive, highly coordinated legal ambush. "That is a completely unbreakable, ironclad, highly irrevocable, living trust," Hayes explained proudly, pointing a sharp finger at the heavy blue folder. "My incredible client, Andre Sterling, established that massive trust entirely for Sergeant Walsh over a decade ago. It completely holds every single hidden real estate asset, every massive offshore account, and every highly valuable corporate investment. And the incredibly beautiful, highly brilliant catch, Your Honor, is that Marcus Walsh possesses absolutely zero legal power to liquidate those massive funds." Isaiah felt the cold, hard floor completely drop out from under his expensive shoes. The massive, hidden millions he had violently sacrificed his entire soul to steal were completely, entirely untouchable. He had entirely ruined his life, completely destroyed his marriage, and heavily borrowed from a dangerous, ruthless mall for a massive, heavily protected vault that could never, ever be opened. The highly secure trust is entirely managed by an independent, completely ruthless board of corporate directors. Hayes continued smoothly, enjoying the absolute suffocating terror radiating from the ruined sun. Sergeant Walsh simply receives a modest, highly comfortable monthly stipend, ensuring he lives quietly, entirely off the radar. The petitioner completely assumed he could just forcefully seize the massive bank accounts, but he entirely failed to do basic, highly necessary corporate research. Victor slumped heavily down into his hard wooden chair, completely burying his sweating face directly into his shaking hands. The disbarred lawyer knew entirely well that breaking an irrevocable corporate trust was an absolute impossible legal fantasy. They had completely played a massive, highly dangerous game for a completely empty, highly secured prize. But the absolute incompetence of the petitioner is not a federal crime, Hayes declared loudly, reaching back into the heavy leather briefcase. Massive, aggressive extortion and highly dangerous criminal conspiracy, however, are absolutely terrifying federal offenses. Hayes pulled out a second highly organized stack of printed papers, sliding them smoothly across the high wooden bench directly toward the completely shocked judge. "We deployed our elite, highly aggressive private investigators, completely tracking the desperate, highly erratic financial movements of Isaiah Walsh over the past 5 days, Hayes explained coldly. The petitioner completely lost his entire massive tech empire last week. He became incredibly desperate, completely terrified of losing his fake high society status. Judge Miller flipped rapidly through the highly detailed printed financial records. "These are massive, incredibly illegal offshore wire transfers," the judge noted carefully, her voice dropping to a highly concerned, quiet whisper. "Exactly, Your Honor." Hayes agreed quickly. The petitioner actively sought out a highly dangerous, completely ruthless underground criminal syndicate. He legally signed a terrifying shadow contract with a man named Silas, instantly securing a massive $10 million dark loan. But the federal government completely seized the illegal funds immediately, leaving the highly arrogant boy with absolutely nothing. Isaiah could not completely breathe. The air in the sterile courtroom felt entirely toxic, completely filling his weak lungs with sharp, painful glass. The elite lawyers knew absolutely everything. They had completely tracked his highly secretive, incredibly desperate walk to the dark lounge, entirely monitoring his massive, highly illegal financial collapse. He owes exactly $12 million to the violent mob by sunset today, Hayes revealed loudly, pointing a highly accusatory, sharp finger directly at the sweating, ruined son. That is the true, highly terrifying motive behind this incredibly disgusting legal circus. He did not file this massive petition to completely protect his father, Your Honor. He filed it to forcefully steal a hidden fortune, completely hoping to pay off massive, highly dangerous criminal debts and entirely save his own pathetic, worthless legs from being brutally shattered by heavy steel tools. Victor suddenly stood up rapidly, his chair scraping loudly against the hard floor. He turned violently toward the heavy oak doors, completely abandoning his ruined client, entirely desperate to physically escape the massive federal trap. But the two elite corporate lawyers immediately stepped directly into the center aisle, completely blocking the only exit, their faces carved from cold, highly unyielding stone. "Sit back down immediately," Counselor Judge Miller commanded loudly, slamming her heavy wooden gavel violently against the high bench. "Nobody is leaving this courtroom until I completely understand the entire highly massive scope of this terrible fraud." Hayes smiled darkly, reaching directly for the sleek silver laptop resting perfectly on the polished table. "Then allow me to completely deliver the final highly devastating piece of absolute undeniable proof, Your Honor," Hayes offered, smoothly opening the bright electronic screen. Hayes quickly tapped a few keys, completely connecting the highly advanced laptop directly to the large, highly modern video screen mounted on the courtroom wall. The screen flickered brightly, instantly displaying the incredibly clear, highly secure hidden camera footage from the modest apartment. "We completely anticipated this incredibly vicious, highly illegal, elder abuse," Hayes explained loudly, addressing the completely silent, highly terrified courtroom. "We actively installed hidden high-definition recording devices entirely throughout the home of the respondent. We completely captured the entire incredibly deceptive interaction last night, flawlessly recorded in absolute undeniable high-definition audio and video." The video began to play loudly, completely echoing through the sterile courtroom. Everyone watched the ruined tech CEO burst aggressively into the modest living room, completely dropping to his weak knees, violently crying his fake, pathetic tears. The clear audio completely captured Isaiah, actively lying about the offshore insurance policy, aggressively using the massive mob debt to force immense unearned sympathy. But the most horrific, utterly devastating moment echoed loudly for everyone to completely hear. They heard Isaiah, actively encouraging the fake, terrifying combat delusions, completely dismissing the imaginary helicopters, and aggressively forcing the cheap plastic pen entirely into the trembling hand of his supposedly broken father. Judge Miller watched the bright screen with absolute, highly visible disgust, her hands trembling slightly with pure, unadulterated, judicial rage. She looked directly down at the signed, highly forged medical waiver resting perfectly on her desk, finally understanding the massive, incredibly vicious psychological manipulation required to obtain it. Isaiah sat entirely frozen, completely paralyzed by absolute, undeniable terror. He was actively watching his entire life violently burn to the ground, entirely broadcast on a massive screen in a highly official court of law. There was absolutely no corporate spin, entirely no clever public relations trick, and absolutely no expensive legal maneuver that could ever save him now. He was completely undeniably trapped in a massive, heavy iron cage of his own incredibly arrogant making. The video on the large screen finally faded completely to black. The sterile courtroom remained absolutely silent, suffocated by the heavy, undeniable weight of the horrific betrayal. Judge Miller stared directly at the dark screen, her face completely pale with absolute righteous fury. She had presided over thousands of highly difficult, incredibly painful family disputes, but she had never witnessed such cold, calculating, vicious cruelty. Marcus Walsh placed his hands firmly on the polished wooden table. He slowly, deliberately pushed himself up from his chair. The pathetic, completely broken slouch disappeared entirely from his broad shoulders. He stood perfectly straight, his chest puffed out proudly, standing with the absolute terrifying posture of a highly decorated combat veteran. He did not look like a frail, confused old man anymore. He looked entirely like a man who had survived a literal, deadly war zone and was entirely prepared to completely finish this final terrible battle. Isaiah watched his father rise, his entire body trembling violently with pure, inescapable panic. He finally realized with absolute terrifying clarity that he was the actual pathetic victim of the massive trap. "Your Honor," Marcus began smoothly, his deep, powerful voice echoing cleanly across the quiet, shocked courtroom. "I humbly apologize for the highly deceptive, completely theatrical performance I gave last night. But as a trained, highly disciplined soldier, I knew I had to completely expose the absolute hidden enemy before I could decisively win the war." "You do not need to apologize for anything, Sergeant Walsh," Judge Miller replied respectfully, her voice softening entirely for the honorable veteran. "Your incredibly brave, highly difficult actions completely saved this court from executing a massive, horrific miscarriage of justice." Marcus turned slowly away from the elevated wooden bench, his sharp, incredibly intelligent eyes locking directly onto his ruined son. Isaiah shrank back heavily into his hard wooden chair, completely unable to meet the cold, unyielding gaze of his father. "You called me a pathetic, washed-up soldier," Marcus said quietly, his voice cutting through the silent room like a heavy, sharp sword. "You completely embarrassed me in front of 300 elite guests because you firmly believed my modest life was an absolute disgusting failure. You entirely convinced yourself that you were a massive, brilliant king, completely untouchable in your shiny fake empire." Isaiah opened his dry mouth, completely desperate to offer a weak, pathetic apology, but absolutely no words came out. He was entirely paralyzed by the massive, heavy weight of his absolute ruin. "But you built your entire massive castle on completely stolen, highly charitable sand," Marcus continued loudly, taking a slow, highly deliberate step toward the petitioner table. "You measured your massive, arrogant worth in expensive designer suits, highly exclusive country clubs, and heavy titanium credit cards. You entirely forgot the absolute fundamental truth of being a real man. True, undeniable wealth is absolutely never measured by the massive size of your bank account, Isaiah. It is strictly measured by the heavy, quiet sacrifices you are entirely willing to make for the people you supposedly love." Andre Sterling watched the incredible confrontation from the center aisle, nodding slowly, highly, completely agreeing with the powerful, unyielding wisdom of his hero. "I completely failed you as a father," Marcus admitted softly, a tiny, highly genuine crack appearing briefly in his powerful voice. "I entirely protected you from the harsh, cold reality of the struggle. I completely hid my combat scars. I entirely downplayed my heavy military service, and I let you completely believe the massive world owed you absolute unearned success. I entirely created this massive, incredibly arrogant monster, and for that, I am profoundly, deeply sorry." Isaiah let out a sudden, highly pathetic, so completely dropping his sweating face back into his shaking hands. "Please, Dad," Isaiah begged weakly, his voice completely muffled by his trembling fingers. "I'm entirely destroyed. Please just let me go." "You completely crossed the absolute final line last night," Marcus declared coldly, his voice returning entirely to absolute, unforgiving iron. "You viciously used my horrific, highly traumatic combat memories, intentionally triggering fake psychological pain purely to steal a hidden fortune. You completely chose pure toxic greed over absolute basic human decency. You are absolutely not my son anymore, Isaiah. You are entirely nothing to me." Marcus turned his back completely on the ruined tech CEO, walking slowly, highly proudly back to his seat at the defense table. The absolute heavy finality of the brutal rejection completely shattered the last remaining pieces of the arrogant mind of his son. Judge Miller picked up her heavy wooden gavel, her eyes completely filled with absolute blazing judicial fury. The massive, incredibly fraudulent petition for emergency conservatorship is entirely permanently denied, the judge announced, loudly slamming the heavy gavel down violently onto the wooden block. Furthermore, based entirely on the absolute undeniable physical evidence presented today, I am taking immediate, highly aggressive legal action. The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open widely. 4 highly armed, entirely serious federal marshals marched briskly down the center aisle, their heavy black boots clicking loudly against the polished floor. I am ordering the immediate absolute arrest of Isaiah Walsh and his deeply corrupt legal counsel, Judge Miller, commanded loudly, pointing her heavy black pen directly at the terrified men. They are to be completely held without bail, entirely pending massive federal charges for severe wire fraud, aggressive elder abuse, and highly coordinated criminal extortion. The federal marshals moved with terrifying absolute speed. They grabbed Victor first, violently yanking the disbarred lawyer out of his chair, completely ignoring his pathetic, weak protests. The heavy, cold steel handcuffs clicked loudly around his thin wrists. 2 massive marshals grabbed Isaiah roughly by the shoulders, completely lifting the ruined CEO right out of his seat. His brand new, expensive suit wrinkled entirely as they twisted his arms aggressively behind his back. The absolute sharp click of the heavy metal handcuffs sealing tightly around his wrists echoed completely through the silent courtroom, entirely symbolizing the absolute permanent end of his fake arrogant life. "You cannot completely do this," Isaiah screamed wildly, highly violently, struggling against the massive, unyielding grip of the federal marshals. "I will be entirely killed in prison. The underground mob will absolutely find me in there." "That is entirely your massive, highly terrifying problem now," Jonathan Hayes noted coldly, completely closing his heavy silver laptop with a sharp, incredibly satisfying snap. The federal marshals dragged Isaiah roughly down the center aisle, completely forcing him to walk the ultimate, highly public walk of absolute shame. He looked wildly around the sterile room, completely desperate for a single tiny ounce of sudden mercy. He looked directly at Andre Sterling, but the powerful billionaire simply turned his broad back, entirely disgusted by the pathetic sight. He finally looked entirely back at his father. Marcus Walsh stood quietly at the defense table, his hands resting easily at his sides, his face completely devoid of any pity, any anger, or any lingering love. He watched his entirely ruined, highly arrogant son being aggressively dragged through the heavy oak doors, completely disappearing entirely into the cold, highly terrifying grasp of absolute federal justice. 6 incredibly long, agonizing months had passed since the heavy oak doors of the Fulton County courtroom had slammed entirely shut. The deafening metallic roar of the industrial commercial laundry facility completely filled the hot, humid air. It was 3:00 in the morning, and the massive windowless warehouse smelled entirely of harsh chemical bleach and stale sweat. Isaiah stood over a massive boiling steel vat, wearing a highly stained, incredibly cheap gray uniform. His hands, which had once been perfectly manicured for elite corporate boardrooms, were completely covered in bright red blisters and deep, painful calluses. He aggressively scrubbed a heavy, incredibly dirty canvas tarp with a stiff wire brush. Every single movement sent a sharp, agonizing spike of pain directly up his tired, aching arms. He was officially an inmate of the Federal Correctional Halfway House, actively serving a deeply humiliating, highly restrictive work release sentence. The elite legal team of Andre Sterling had completely dismantled his fake life. They had aggressively seized every single remaining asset, completely liquidated the massive Buckhead estate, and legally redirected every single penny directly to the Federal Restitution Fund. Isaiah was currently earning exactly $4 an hour, and the federal government immediately garnished 80% of his pathetic wages. He paused for a brief, incredibly painful second, wiping the heavy, stinging sweat from his tired eyes. He looked down at the dirty, bubbling gray water in the steel vat, completely seeing his own ruined, highly pathetic reflection. He looked absolutely nothing like a brilliant, untouchable tech CEO. He looked exactly like a broken, deeply exhausted man, completely stripped of his massive ego and his shiny, fake dignity. His beautiful, highly calculating wife, Brenda, had not visited him a single time. She had filed for a highly aggressive, completely uncontested divorce the very morning after his highly public arrest. She had immediately fled the city of Atlanta, completely erasing his toxic, ruined name from her elite social circles. Isaiah was entirely, completely alone in the world, surrounded only by other broken, desperate men who did not care at all about his former corporate glory. He remembered the absolute terrifying finality of his federal sentencing hearing. Jonathan Hayes, the ruthless corporate litigator, had completely destroyed his expensive criminal defense attorney. The massive, undeniable video evidence of the psychological abuse had entirely disgusted the federal judge. Isaiah had been formally stripped of all executive voting rights, completely banned from holding any corporate office for the rest of his natural life, and ordered to pay $10 million in aggressive, punitive restitution. The violent underground mob had completely tried to collect their massive debt, entirely unaware of the sudden federal arrest. Silas had aggressively sent his heavy enforcers to the locked Buckhead estate, only to find heavily armed federal marshals completely securing the massive perimeter. The Shadow Syndicate quickly realized Isaiah was entirely useless, heavily burdened by the federal prison system, and completely devoid of any secret funds. They abandoned the dangerous debt, entirely leaving Isaiah to safely rot in his own legal cage, knowing the massive psychological torture of the heavy labor was far worse than a broken kneecap. "Keep moving, Walsh." The heavy, incredibly aggressive voice of the shift supervisor boomed loudly over the loud machinery. The supervisor, a massive man with cold, highly unsympathetic eyes, walked directly past the boiling vat. "You have exactly 200 more heavy tarps to scrub completely clean before the morning shift arrives. I do not pay you to stand around daydreaming about your fancy, rich past." Isaiah swallowed the sharp, incredibly bitter pride that immediately rose in his dry throat. "Yes, sir." Isaiah replied quietly, completely, keeping his tired head bowed low. He aggressively pushed the stiff wire brush back into the boiling chemical water, completely scrubbing the heavy canvas until his raw muscles screamed in pure, absolute agony. The heavy wire brush slipped rapidly from his tired fingers, completely splashing a heavy drop of boiling chemical water directly onto his exposed wrist. Isaiah winced violently, letting out a sharp, pathetic gasp of intense pain. A massive, red burn mark appeared instantly on his skin, but he absolutely did not dare to stop working. He quickly retrieved the heavy brush from the dirty water, aggressively forcing his tired hands to completely ignore the massive, agonizing sting. There was absolutely no elite public relations team to completely spin this terrible narrative. There was no highly expensive lawyer coming to forcefully secure his immediate release. He completely lived in a tiny, highly depressing cinder block cell, sleeping on a thin, highly uncomfortable mattress. He ate cheap, highly processed cafeteria food, completely remembering the expensive vintage champagne and the rare imported truffles from his lavish, arrogant brunch. The heavy, inescapable reality of his absolute ruin crushed down upon him every single night. He had violently traded a quiet, highly honorable relationship with a loving father completely for a fragile, highly toxic illusion of massive wealth. He had viciously attempted to destroy an old decorated soldier purely to save his own massive, unearned pride. And now he was actively paying the ultimate highly agonizing price, scrubbing the heavy, dirty laundry of the city, completely forgotten by the massive, wealthy world he had so desperately tried to conquer. He scrubbed harder, letting the harsh chemical fumes burn his tired lungs. He completely knew, deep in his dark, ruined heart, that he absolutely deserved every single second of this incredibly heavy, agonizing torment. 200 miles completely away from the suffocating heavy smog of Atlanta, the morning air was incredibly crisp. Marcus Walsh sat peacefully on the sprawling, wide wooden porch of his beautiful brand-new lake house. The massive custom-built cabin sat directly on the quiet shores of Lake Oconee, completely surrounded by towering ancient pine trees. He held a warm ceramic mug of black coffee in his strong hands, watching the bright golden sunrise completely paint the calm water. He was wearing a simple, comfortable flannel shirt, completely at peace, entirely free from the heavy, toxic drama of his ruined son. The quiet, peaceful morning was gently broken by the low, powerful hum of a massive engine. A sleek, entirely custom black luxury sedan rolled slowly down the long, winding gravel driveway, completely avoiding the deep ruts. The heavy car stopped perfectly near the wooden steps, and Andre Sterling stepped smoothly out into the cool morning air. The powerful billionaire was dressed casually today, wearing a heavy, dark cashmere sweater entirely matching the relaxed, peaceful environment. Andre walked slowly up the wide wooden steps, carrying a thick, heavy leather portfolio under his right arm. "It is incredibly beautiful out here," Sergeant Andre noted quietly, taking a deep, refreshing breath of the clean pine air. "It is the absolute perfect peace I always wanted," Marcus replied warmly, gesturing smoothly to the empty, comfortable rocking chair right next to him. "Sit down, Andre. The fresh coffee is entirely hot, and the quiet lake is completely putting on a beautiful show." Andre sat down heavily in the wooden rocking chair, placing the thick leather portfolio gently onto the small table between them. He accepted a steaming mug of dark coffee, completely relaxing his broad shoulders. "I received the final, highly official legal reports from the federal restitution courts yesterday," Andre explained softly, looking directly out over the sparkling, calm water. "The massive corporate bankruptcy of Isaiah is completely, absolutely finalized. The federal government seized every single remaining asset, and he is fully serving his heavy, restrictive labor sentence." Marcus did not flinch, and he absolutely did not look away from the rising sun. He made his own highly arrogant, incredibly destructive choices, Marcus stated, calmly, his voice completely devoid of any lingering heavy sorrow. He entirely worshipped a fake, highly toxic illusion of massive wealth, and it completely burned his arrogant life to the absolute ground. "I have entirely mourned the loss of my son Andre, but I'm completely done carrying his heavy, dark ghost." Andre nodded slowly, entirely, respecting the massive, unyielding strength of his hero. "That brings us directly to the massive, highly secure trust fund." Andre continued, tapping the thick leather portfolio with his strong hand. "You have hundreds of millions of dollars entirely sitting in highly secure corporate accounts, Marcus. You absolutely refuse to buy massive yachts or highly expensive, useless luxury items. We need to completely establish a powerful, lasting legacy for this massive wealth." Marcus took a slow, highly thoughtful sip of his warm coffee. "I have been entirely thinking about exactly that," Marcus replied smoothly. "I spent completely 30 years in the military entirely trying to build strong, honorable young men. I entirely failed with my own flesh and blood, but I completely refused to let that single failure define my entire legacy." He turned his sharp, highly intelligent eyes directly toward the billionaire. "Do you completely remember the young, highly dedicated combat medic who works the late-night shift at the downtown Veteran Center?" Marcus asked quietly. "His name is Jamal Andre." Recalled instantly, his sharp corporate memory completely pulling up the exact file. He served 2 highly dangerous tours in Syria, completely paying his own way through night school right now, studying incredibly hard for a complex engineering degree. Marcus smiled warmly, a genuine, completely bright expression of absolute pride. "I watched Jamal closely for the past 6 months," Marcus continued, smoothly leaning back comfortably in his wooden rocking chair. I watched him quietly sweep the dirty floors of the community center completely long after his official shift was entirely over. I watched him entirely surrender his own warm coat, directly giving it to a homeless, shivering veteran on the freezing street. He possesses absolute, undeniable integrity, Andre. He has the exact, highly honorable foundation that my own son entirely lacked. Andre nodded slowly, entirely understanding the massive, profound weight of the decision. You are entirely placing a massive multi-million-dollar financial weapon directly into his young hands, Andre noted carefully. It will completely change his entire life overnight, Marcus. I completely know it will, Marcus replied confidently. But massive, sudden wealth only completely destroys the people who entirely believe they are absolutely entitled to it. Jamal entirely knows the brutal, heavy cost of every single dollar. He will completely use this massive foundation to absolutely lift other honorable men up entirely, instead of using it to violently crush them down. I want to completely restructure the massive trust, Marcus declared firmly, his voice completely ringing with absolute undeniable purpose. I want to instantly establish a massive, highly endowed foundation entirely dedicated to completely funding the brilliant, highly driven business ideas of returning combat veterans. I want to completely strip all massive, unearned privilege out of the equation, entirely focusing on absolute, undeniable merit and hard work. I want to entirely hand Jamal the absolute golden keys to the entire kingdom, Marcus confirmed proudly. He will completely manage the massive funds entirely under your highly experienced corporate guidance, Andre. He absolutely knows what it means to completely struggle, and he entirely knows how to build massive strength from absolute heavy pain. He is the exact, incredibly honorable son I always completely wanted. Andre opened the thick leather portfolio, entirely pulling out a sleek, heavy gold pen. I will have Jonathan Hayes completely draft the massive legal transfer by tomorrow morning, Andre promised smoothly. We will entirely change the complete trajectory of thousands of honorable lives, Marcus. It is an absolutely beautiful, highly brilliant plan. Marcus looked directly back out at the bright golden sunrise, completely feeling the heavy, dark shadows of the past completely melt away. He had entirely lost an arrogant, highly ungrateful son to absolute greed, but he had completely found a beautiful, highly profound purpose in the massive wreckage. The quiet, peaceful lake rippled gently in the morning breeze, entirely reflecting the absolute, untouchable peace in his strong, honorable heart. True wealth is not measured by designer suits or corporate titles, but by the quiet sacrifices we make for others. When arrogance blinds a son to the honorable foundation of his father, the resulting collapse is inevitable. Real success requires humility, and respect is a debt that must always be paid.